All right. Welcome, folks, to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I'm joined by John Streeter. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing all right. I'm ready to get canceled. So let's do this.
I just want to say on the front end, folks, this is a very sensitive topic that people have a lot of feelings about. We're going to talk about the transgender issue today. And I'm going to make my effort to be extremely sensitive to this topic. There was maybe about a week ago or so, John, I put a post out on Facebook. Some, I was online. I saw some data come across. I read the article. It seemed interesting and compelling to me. Not that I believed it, but that it was worthy of putting out into the public arena and allowing all of us who think about these issues to have it as information to weigh in amongst all the information to make educated decisions. And so that's the messy issue. And I've seen you delve into this topic numerous times and you get so much pushback. The moment you say anything, even not even trans related, and people jump into the post like they did the other day on a post where somebody jumped in and said, John's transphobic. I don't listen to anything he says, right? And I don't think you're transphobic. I responded, and here's where I'm going to give you the time. I responded to that saying, I don't think John's transphobic. I think John wants as positive an outcome for as many of the folks who experience this as possible. He doesn't see the data from your perspective. He thinks the other side of the data is worth much more consideration than one side is giving it, and that it should influence and affect how we make policies and decisions around this. And then I asked, and I didn't see your answer, maybe you did answer it, but I said, "John, are you transphobic or do you want as positive an outcome for these folks as possible and you simply have a different perspective about what accomplishes that?" And so now with all that said, I turn the time over to you, John Streeter.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to apologize to you and your channel because you're going to be forever changed in the eyes of many people for even hosting this discussion. Number one,
Yeah.
you're platforming somebody who's already been labeled a transphobic bigot among certain people. And so the idea that you're having me to talk about it before you're having somebody on the trans right activist side of the debate to talk about it is already problematic. You've already said several different things that, depending on which degree of ideological intensity on this issue, people would already label some of the things that you've said as highly problematic. But all of the questions that you're raising regarding this issue are really, really important for us as a society and really, really relevant. But there's a discussion that needs to be had before you have any of the arguments about whether or not trans people should be on sports teams with their identified gender, whether or not you should be intervening hormonally or surgically in children who experience gender dysphoria. There's something you have to step back and understand before you even dive into those waters. And so, what I hope to do today is to kind of do that foundational understanding so that then when you go into a discussion about this issue, then you can make sure that you're talking about the same things. And the way that I want to approach this is not a one side is wrong, one side is right way. And I'm
Right.
hoping that this is a presentation that people, regardless of how they feel about this issue, could say, yeah, that does make sense from my perspective. Because what I hope to be able to have the viewer at the end of this discussion say is that these debates about things like bathrooms and sports teams are being had by people who are compassionate, empathetic, and rational.
Mhm.
They are starting from different positions regarding some important aspects about the human experience and conceptions of reality. And because they're starting from different positions, they're making moral arguments that are very rational from that starting position. And they're doing it with the same, you know, compulsion of, I want to do right. I have compassion for people who experience different things, and I want to try to find the best way forward. And that's on both sides.
Mhm.
And so now the thing that gets a little bit difficult is if the side that you're on is unable to pull yourself out of your position and look at the other person not as an enemy, but as somebody who actually is trying to do the right thing, but and then understand why they think the thing that they're advocating for is right. If you can't do that to the person on the other side, then that's a red flag that you might be so steeped in your own ideological position that you have dehumanized the other person and then just take some time and maybe listen to some different voices, surround yourself with some different perspectives, just so that you can start to understand the issue a little bit better. And so maybe this conversation will be the first step on that pathway if you found yourself in that situation. So I think that's kind of the my basic intro for what I want to talk about today. And just, as soon as I saw your post, I'm like, oh, Bill is stepping into it. Okay, he's gonna, you're gonna get your reputation's gonna go down, and people may end up, painting you with a brush and putting a red A on your back. And so anytime you want to talk about anything, you'll get certain people popping up and reminding everyone that you've platformed a transphobe and therefore are problematic yourself. But any response to what I've just laid out?
I only want to say one more thing and then let you start, which is I understand the perspective that the side, and again, I think they deeply care about either transgender themselves or they deeply care about folks who are transgender. And the perspective is this, it's that if you let the other side put false research, false data into the arena, then what could happen is that you end up with transgender individuals being manipulated by bad data into making the wrong decisions and end up with negative outcomes. And the vitriol that I see seems to come from that place. Like, hey, I know you're wrong. And by you simply stating the other side of the aisle and giving that data, you are putting these kids at risk. You are making it harder for these families to make good decisions. And hence we end up with more negative outcomes for these folks. And I want to grant that that is a possible permutation, that it is possible that when you share both sides of information, when you encourage people to gather information, just like the religion we came from, it's possible that some people will go read apologetics. It will convince them of what they want to hear. Again, and I want to say on the front end, I don't know which side is right. I should say that too. I don't know which side is right. I'm exploring both sides. I'm trying right now to make educated decisions. And there are times in my life where I've explored both sides and I decided the wrong thing, learning later that that data wasn't accurate. And so I think there's room here for some fear, apprehension, worry that if we put all the information out there, it's the bad information that will sway somebody, and people will have feelings about what the risk of that is. And then there is real risk of people being harmed or harming themselves, even to the point of taking their own life. And so this topic is extremely sensitive and it does deserve a lot of like, let's just take this slow. Let's think about that study. What does that study say? Okay, well, what's the flaws there? What's the strengths? Okay, what about this study? It's on the other side. What's the flaws? What's the strengths? But the only way we can arrive at the best decisions at the end of the day about how best to navigate this issue is to have both sides of the information represented. Think of any time in your life where you were isolated to one side's information, and it was that the most effective way to make an educated, informed decision where you consensually decide what it is that's right or wrong, and choose that as your perspective in your life. And I just don't think there's any moment where that's real. And so you have to have information from both or all sides. It's the only way that we can know and sort out. And again, we're flawed human beings. Even then we may make the wrong decision, but it's our best chance to get at the truth and to see through a glass less darkly.
Yeah, so you're describing your approach to questions about what is true. And
Mhm.
it's a very rational, empiric, modern sort of approach that is loaded at the front end with a great degree of epistemic humility. Like, you understand that you are liable and possible of getting things wrong and that you are clouded with biases. And so it's important to look at both sides and to apply some rationality to your analysis to try to do your best at achieving what is true, understanding that you always have to be open to new information and new arguments. And that's placing you in one particular camp that I hope you're going to see. It's at the level of this discussion. Like, this is the discussion that needs to be had. And so I'm going to take a little bit of pressure off of the conversation. Today, we're not going to say what is right or wrong. We're not going to say what is true. Our our job today is not prescriptive. We're not trying to tell people how they should think or what they should think about this or any issue. Today, we are going to be descriptive, and that is we're just going to simply dig down and realize that at the base level of this entire debate, in all of its dimensions, are key philosophical differences and premises that are different depending on which side that you're on. And we're not going to say which side is the better side or which side is the right side. We're just going to look at it and say, okay, there are some differences. And so if you're in a discussion with someone, it's okay to step back and just clarify, hey, are you approaching it from this perspective with these assumptions? And if you are, then maybe some of the words that you're using are a little bit different or imply different things than some of the words I'm using because I'm coming at it from a slightly different thing. And then if you can understand those foundational differences, it's less prone perhaps for you to get so heated that you get lost in the weeds of the fact that you're arguing things using different definitions for words, which is really difficult. So let's go ahead and get started then. Okay, so I was watching this debate between two people on either side of this issue, and they would frequently come head to head, going into large rants about why trans women should be in sports or not in sports, and it was so frustrating because you realize that there's a discussion that they haven't had below that level that needs to be had. So in the great gender debate, chances are you've come across this type of argument. It's most fundamentally expressed in the bold assertion that someone will come out and say that trans women are women, and then other people will say no, they're not. Trans women are men, and both sides will accuse the other side of being wrong. And usually, it's not just that you're wrong; it's you're wrong and you're a bad person to it. So there's a heavy moral valence to this whole thing. It's loaded very much with a lot of emotion, and we're going to try to take a look at this. So you'll find the gender debate gets blown up in a bunch of different arenas. And the most common ones are going to be on the issue of medical care, specifically in doing surgical or hormonal interventions in young kids, adolescents, and adults. You'll find it in the world of sports, where people who are identifying as a different gender would like to compete in their identified gender. And because that, from another perspective, is seen as an incursion on the rights of the other gender, then a battle ensues. You'll see it in prisons, for where right now we have gender segregated prisons. And so when people try to break those boundaries and be housed with their identified gender, some people say that's a safety issue for the usually it's women, for the women in the prison. The same thing for things like rape shelters or abuse shelters. When you look at our public health institutions, how they gather statistics, and when you look at public safety concerns, frequently this will be, for example, in restrooms, which have historically been gender segregated in our modern Western world. So it's an important issue that you're going to find pop up in many different domains. And this is to say nothing of the type of debates that happen. These all translate into heated debates online. And there seems to be some disconnect on this question of the words that you use, what they refer to, and they're kind of diametrically opposed. You can't have one without the other. And so one side has to be right and the other side has to be wrong. And you're going to see that which of those is right and wrong differently based on where you are in that thing. But what I hope to try to convey, and hopefully out of this discussion, people will understand, is that these different positions are conclusions that get arrived at when you start from your understanding of the world, your understanding of knowledge and how we form it, your understanding of human society and human identity is very different depending on if you start from a different philosophical basis. And one of them is going to be the modern scientific, rational, empiric perspective. And the other one is going to be something that people have described as postmodern relativism. And many people may have seen and understood and come to know a particular perspective at the higher level, at the level of trans women are women, and you can identify as something. And they may not understand that in order for them to say those things, they have to have already assumed as a starting point some postmodern relativist perspectives. But you don't have to go and study Michel Foucault or Judith Butler or any of the philosophers who laid the groundwork for this way of thinking. You can simply adopt trans women are women and all of the assumptions with that and not realize that that's where that line of thinking came from. There is a whole line of philosophical thought about the nature of existence, the nature of society and humanity that leads you to be able to make that statement and be rational in doing it. And so that's kind of the understanding that we want to kind of pull back and realize that there's a foundational difference in how you're approaching these issues. So, how do you know that you're in one of these worlds? Well, I've put some words that are frequently associated with these two different perspectives. And as you look at these words, maybe you'll understand why some of the differences happen. So, under the modern scientific rational empiric perspective, which is going to be historically the baseline perspective. If you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you're kind of at the tail end of where most of that in conventional modern society was rooted in rational empiricism. True, in that time frame, you could go into the universities, into the academies, and really ever since the 1960s, you could find at the academy level people who have been exploring these ideas about postmodernism, and they would have started to make those cases, and they seeped into activist movements in the 60s and beyond. But for the most part, most of us that grew up in the West have a rational perspective, which you articulated at the beginning of this discussion. So if you're talking about things logically, rationally, if you place a high priority on reason, if it's kind of a conventional way of looking at things, if you are looking at things scientifically, it's generally associated with kind of the Western world. If you are focused on something reflecting and accurately describing and therefore being able to predict reality, then that is a modern scientific rational empiric perspective, and it's traditional. It's kind of what has led us to where we are, up until the most recent times. Now, you want to contrast that with postmodern relativism, and it is characterized with a great deal of skepticism about all of those things that we just listed on the rational scientific realm. You could say, well, how could you be skeptic about the scientific method? How could you be skeptical about logic and reason? Well, if you say, hold on a second, we don't ever really actually know anything for 100%. And if you look at all of those things that people say they know and you really trace it down, it's really that knowledge, or being able to decide that that knowledge is real, is a form of power. And it's a form of power that has allowed some people to gain dominance in culture, society, economy, or so forth. And so claims of knowledge are really claims of power, and they're a way to structure and order and maintain power. And so, since I know that that is a human reality, that people will exploit the marginalized, exploit the less fortunate in order to keep and maintain power, I have to have a high degree of skepticism of any and all institutions that claim to just tell me how I'm supposed to know things. It's generally associated with something being subjective or relative. So when you hear people say that, if you go around the world claiming that your approach to science, your approach to culture, your approach to ethics is somehow superior, well, that's wrong and it's oppressive, because you are not considering the experience and the lived experience of other cultures, and they are no less legitimate or no less moral than yours. In fact, your own sense of morality is a form of power and boundary maintenance. And that skepticism that I just described, that we have to look at because it's rooted in power dynamics, also, morality is just another form of power and oppression that is, imposed on a society by people who want to keep themselves in power. And so you'll find a bunch of different terms that have ended up amalgamating into what we are seeing today. And, woke or wokeness is one of them. You'll hear the word critical being used a lot, and you could look at the wide world of where this manifests, and you'll see things like critical race theory, or critical fat studies, or critical fill in the blank studies. And what those things are referring to is, it's referring to a branch of philosophy as well called critical theory, which took a lot of that skepticism that postmodernism has about, institutions that have existed and kind of guided society as, people who are trying to keep and maintain power. And it's kind of looking at all these different dimensions through a lens that sees things as the powerful and the weak, the oppressor and the oppressed, and it tries to look for and identify the points of contact of that oppression. And then a lot of the literature is just trying to flesh out how those oppressive structures exist, how they are manifest. And so when you see things like microaggressions being posited as a form of oppression or power, that's just an extension of this critical theory perspective that looks for how the oppressed may influence or dominate the marginalized. And you get clout and you get your name known for being able to waken people up to new ways to see this oppressor repressed dynamic. And so these two different philosophical worldviews, you probably, if you're only engaging on this discussion on the level of trans men are men versus trans men are women, or vice versa, you may not realize that this is really a battle between two philosophies about the nature of the world, the nature of truth, the nature of knowledge, and the nature of power. And so that's kind of what we're going to dive into a little bit on the gender realm today.
Is it fair to say what I sort of heard you again, I heard a lot of things you said, but one part of what you said seemed to me to be saying, look, if we humans could just be flawless at being logical and reasonable and conventional and scientific, reality based, traditional and Western, I might set off to the side because they seem to come from a certain perspective from a certain geographic or chronological time period, right? But rational, logical, reason, conventional, scientific, reality based. If we could do that flawlessly, then maybe we get somewhere. But because human beings have structured our tribes and now our societies in power structure sort of hierarchies, we never really can be 100% rational. We can never really be 100% logical. And so we do the best we can, but there's a lot of people who want to maintain the power they have. There's a lot of
Mhm.
groups that pay money to ensure that research goes a certain direction. And hence, it's appropriate on some level to not trust science 100%, to not trust someone claiming to be a rational thinker and even putting across what appears to be a rational idea 100%. And we already realize that those things have been misused before. Hence, we
Mhm.
should be skeptical. We should recognize power. We should understand how one thing is relative to another. We should be revolutionary and trying to continue to make changes, even if everyone's telling us everything's okay right now. Everything is sort of subjective. And am I fair in saying that there is a place for both of these camps, and they sort of are the checks and balances of each other?
Right. So a lot of the impulses that spawned the postmodern movement are absolutely important realizations or observations about human psychology and the way that abuses happen, the way the tyrannical government comes. A lot of this philosophy was born out of a moment in human history where we were dealing with the reality of mass human casualties in the nuclear age, and we were dealing with widespread abuses of the industrialization that was driven by what people were seeing as rampant capitalism. And it was done from a perspective that was trying to wrestle with, all of these shadowy parts of the modern world. And so it was born out of that. Now, the purpose of this discussion is not really to say which side is right or wrong. I think this is one of those things where everybody kind of just has to look at the different arguments that are made from those different points and kind of figure out what resonates with them and what makes sense. Now, I'll say that the all of those observations that you just made, there's no reason for somebody from a modern scientific rational empiric perspective to say no, that's wrong. You're wrong, Bill. That's not the way it works. Like, the fact that humans are greedy, callous, and want power and influence over other people very much fits in with the modern rational scientific empiric perspective. It's just that the postmodern side looked at those issues and said, well, now we have to be so radically skeptical of any enterprise that the spirit of revolution, the spirit of dismantling and disrupting became the dominant spirit that energized that movement. And so you'll find this type of thinking generally is partnered up with calls for those things, with calls for radical revolution and for dismantling. Now, somebody in the modern scientific rational empiric perspective will look at the failings of the past, try to study and understand how they went wrong, and then try to build out new structures, new approaches, new paradigms that account for them. So when we look at the modern scientific perspective, that would include when some study turns out to be found to be, problematic in the future, well, they'll go back and try to discover where the biases existed, and a whole field of study about how to understand and account for biases was born out of that. And so when you propose, for example, in medical research, a study, you're supposed to be looking at the front end for the potential biases that may distort your data and your interpretation, and you're supposed to try to overcome them by your study design. And then the whole academic process of allowing peer review of a published literature is supposed to be taking people who have different biases to use different biases to check each other. And it's called institutional disconfirmation, where you want competing institutions to try to pick apart each other through pointing out inconsistencies or biases that you as a human may have. And so, from the scientific, rational, empiric perspective, you would say, I have biases. They don't completely invalidate my work or my product, but I have to try to account for and overcome them. And I have to subject my work to criticism from other people. And our society thrives on the ability for different institutions to try to disconfirm something that I've published. Now, the postmodern relativist thing, you might find something more along the lines of, well, everybody has biases. And so people are going to simply lean into their biases and say that this is just the way the world is. Everybody has biases. And so you can kind of choose your bias. And so I think this is manifest most clearly in the world of journalism, where an older perspective may be, as journalists, we need to remain impartial. We need to not allow our bias to infuse our reporting. And we've seen our journalism industry transform so that now the perspective is, I do have bias. We all have bias. I'm going to lean into my particular bias. And the understanding should be that people should just choose their journalist source according to the bias that they want. So if you go to CNN or MSNBC, you'll get one bias that you can choose. And if you go to Fox News or if you go to a different source, you'll see another bias that you want. And that type of journalism can it's we rely on journalism as a kind of fourth pillar of society to try to help us sort truth from error. And as it's transformed into more of just bias replication machinery, people have lost a lot of confidence in journalism. But that's just more of a reflection of people do still, despite some of these notions of postmodern relativism seeping into our minds, people still do think that there's an important dimension to getting something right or having the truth be said. So, and again, I think when I first heard people describing this stuff, I was like, there is no, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. Nobody can think that truth doesn't matter, or that all truth is simply an expression of power, or that language is the way that we shape our reality. And so you need to control language in order to shape what a reality is supposed to be had. That sounds like science fiction jargon of some, evil, nefarious thing. But when you go back and you look at the various philosophers who have built the foundation of that worldview, that is very much the perspective that they took. And so um, I, I'm not trying to say that your audience should just listen to me and then believe me. If you want to say, well, is this true? Is what Streeter's saying true? Just like go and read some of the people who are making these cases, and see if this is the starting point that they come from.
Two quick things. So, one is that you're pointing to, yes, if we only look for information from the bias that we want to hold, we're all going to find ourselves simply in echo chambers, and we're not going to be able to hear anything from the other side and be able to really form informed opinions about ideas and come to better conclusions and end up with progress. What we'll just end up with is a dichotomy of two sides fighting against each other on every single issue. Number one. So I agree with you. We do have to avoid, I think, on some level, aligning ourselves only with information or journalists or news sources that feed the current belief we have and want to maintain. Number one. Number two is that you said, I'm not here to tell you which of these camps is right. And I'm wondering if I can push you a little bit and say, wouldn't it be more fair to say neither camp is right? Both camps are necessary, that there may be flaws and shadows in both camps, and there are strengths in I don't want to say ideals, but there's strengths and principles that help us to improve and create a better world for the collective good of all of us in both camps as well.
I think so. I mean, I think there are definitely some observations about humanity that come from the postmodern world, and observations about language and the way society relies on language that are important observations. And I think even somebody from a rational scientific perspective can look at that and understand the significance of those things. Part of the challenge that happens is that the modern scientific rational perspective is very much a descriptive perspective. They are trying to understand the world and describe the world. And it's the power of that type of knowledge that allows us to make predictions, that allow us to innovate technologically, and to then kind of operate in the ways that we have, that has driven a lot of the progress that humanity has seen in technology and agriculture and healthcare and in many different dimensions. Now, the postmodern relativist world, they're very much not so much just about describing things, they're also about praxis. One of the classic quotes is, the point of this understanding is not just to understand the world, it's to change it. Like you become awakened, you get a critical consciousness, you realize that these systems of oppression are out there, and there is now a moral imperative upon you to go and to break it down, to go
Right.
and try to change it. And that impulse is why you'll see people probably say disparaging things about you for platforming me, is because that by platforming me, that praxis dimension of it, you're working against it. You're giving greater signal out there to perspectives that are not only on one side of this issue. And that's one of the key differences that you'll see, is kind of that activist part of it. Now, if you dig really deep, like pure postmodernists, they believe that you can never actually know the world. You can't trust any institution, and there's almost like no point. There's like a lot of nihilism in that sort of stuff. But it's the infusion of that critical theory married with that radical skepticism of postmodernism that gives us the kind of the very activist minded thing, where you're seeing the world through the lens of oppression, and then there's a moral imperative on you to go out and change that. And so that marriage of postmodernism and critical theory has a bunch of different names. That's kind of what we call wokeness, or critical social justice is another term that you'll hear frequently said about it. Those are kind of the main differences there. I agree with you. I don't think you can write off either of these things. Clearly, you can't write off scientific empiricism. You also can't write off postmodern relativism. I think there's important observations about it. The question is, what do you want your society to be based on? Beyond that, also, is one of these perspectives conducive to a pluralistic society that allows for freedom of thought and freedom of belief? And if you've got a group of people who believe they know how the world should work, they know how to define the oppressor and the oppressed, and they have a moral duty to go out and shape the world in that way, well, those are kind of religious sort of motivations that have a great deal of certainty about their position, very little epistemic humility. And so you could imagine that those produce different trajectories for an individual's life if they're in that camp, and for a society's kind of atmosphere if it's filled with people like that.
Yeah, and I will say too, I've seen both of us operate out of both of these camps, and I can, in my own head, deem that in both instances I could see good reason and good motives and desired good outcomes by operating out of those. But I also agree with you that if you're sure your side is right and you try to silence the other side, there are blind spots to doing that, and hence you sort of cut off the ability to access information from the other side, which even if they're in the wrong, there may be value in some point of view or some data point that they're looking to share that would then shape our progress. And so I agree with you in that regard as well.
Okay. Well, I think with that foundation laid, let's first give a name to this phenomenon, which is ideology. So I think understanding that ideologies exist, and that the church was a form of ideology in the domain of somebody's spiritual life. But when you leave the church and you enter the wider world, that you still have to operate by some ideology. And so if you just from a very high level, very broad sense say, okay, an ideology is a collection of beliefs, opinions, and assertions that make up a worldview or a self-conception, then I think that generic term for ideology allows you to say, okay, well, both of these things that we're talking about are a form of ideology. It's a collection of beliefs, opinions, and assertions that make up a worldview. And you may not realize that that was your ideology, but as you examine it more, as you examine your thought processes and your assumptions, you'll start to realize that you tend to favor one of these camps or resonate more with one of them. Okay, so I mentioned before that the marriage of postmodernism and critical theory was an important move. Postmodernism, again, is radical skepticism, believing that all truth is relative, that language constructs reality, and that power dynamics and oppression are really under a lot of it. And you marry that to critical theory, which is a critique of social structures focused on inequality, oppression, power, and ideology, and that it's married to this intense call to praxis or to activism in order to try to root out those power dynamics and power imbalances and dismantle the structures that have them. Now, you'll hear dismantle a great deal in the realm of postmodern relativism and critical theory, whereas in the rational scientific world, you'll hear reform because they're trying to build on what already exists and refine it and improve it over time. A lot of this critical theory perspective is really bent on dismantling revolution and deconstruction, and a lot of it tends to get focused on things like capitalism, things that really represent a lot of the traditional Western values. Okay, so you can see these married principles together when you look at how it manifests on several different domains. So, on the question of race, you'll have critical race theory. On the question of gender, you'll have gender theory. On the question of something that, kind of came out of the blue when I first dove into this, I didn't realize that there was something called critical disability theory, which looks at the idea that we consider some people disabled or something an illness is a form of marginalization and oppression, and that's rooted in some old notion of superiority of people who have a certain ability. And so you have to deconstruct those assumptions and try to see this issue from a different lens. And then you have something that is probably the great hydra at the root of it all, which is queer theory. And when I first came out of the church, I would hear people use the word queer, and I assumed it meant gay. And then I would hear people say, "Well, I'm not just gay, I'm queer." And so there was a distinction on that. But then the question is, well, what does queer mean? And it's really hard because you just assume it means not straight, but then you would hear people talk about pansexuality and just like a whole bunch of different things. And if you then go in and read the literature that came to be known as queer theory, you understand that the thing that is trying to be destabilized and disrupted is normality, things that are considered to be normal or conventional wisdom or within the narrow range of accepted propriety. Well, queer theory starts from the position of those things are social constructs that are arbitrary and they're rooted in maintaining certain elements of society in positions of power. And part of our praxis can be to point out that power imbalance and disrupt it and try to flip it on its head so that that those dominant forces no longer have the ability to oppress the marginalized people who don't fall into those normal rigid categories.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, so I think an easy example to use would be right-handedness and left-handedness, right?
Mhm.
So right-handedness is the majority of human beings, left-handed people are a minority. And it's easy to go, well, you know what? Sorry, this is capitalism. We're going to only sell for the most part right-handed scissors and we're only going to sell, tools and things that are made for right-handed people. And left-handed people are at a disadvantage because society is built around. So the critical theory would come in and essentially challenge that and go, it's
Mhm.
not fair that everything is made for right-handed people and left-handed people have to adapt at whatever loss it means to society, whatever loss it means to production, whatever loss it means it profits, it shouldn't matter. Left-handed people should have equal access to all of the same things that right-handed people have an advantage over. So we get rid of the advantage completely. We level the playing field And while there is a truth to that, you also would have to recognize that you are disrupting systems to maybe the extreme of them falling apart and whatever is there afterward. And it may sound silly, but when you force everybody to equalize everything for every expression of humanity, there is a potential outcome where all of it falls apart and you end up with something way worse and chaotic than the unfair disadvantage of society as it currently is.
It's a great metaphor. I mean, because you could even look at that and say, well, there's actually two potential solutions for that. It could be, well, we need to try to somehow promote or advance people or companies, or just the idea that you should also offer a left-handed solution. And that's one way. Or you could say, you know what? Anything that is not ambidextrous, anything that is not completely accessible to the same extent by both left and right-handed people is wrong. Therefore, we will control the market and only allow things that are neutral with regard to hand. Like, those are two different ways to solve this particular problem, and they involve various different forms of what end up having to be state force or state coercion in order to restrict the way that a market would normally respond to different levels of demand. And so that's where this battle between capitalism and things that aren't capitalism, usually like socialism, or you'll find Marxist kind of economy thought tossed in here a lot of the times. It's kind of like right now, if you go and look at the different protests that are happening around the nation at the college campuses, you're going to find a lot of Marxist socialist symbology along there. But that's because this postmodern relativist conception involves a lot of people who saw the answer to inequalities that they would point out as the power imbalances as rooted in capitalism, and they saw non-capitalist solutions as the answer to that. So Michel Foucault is like the granddaddy of postmodernism, was an avowed Marxist and then Maoist, but a lot of that line of thinking, because it was rooted on pointing out imbalances in whether economic or class or some other dimension, served as the basis for the line of thinking that eventually led to what we find today in things like critical theory and critical social justice, that then gets expressed through the academy in these various different studies,
I want to say one more thing, which
fields.
is in regards to say left-handed and right-handed. Think about this, folks. We teach children, again, we're sort of past that. We're not teaching writing anymore, and handwriting sucks for everybody. But if we back up to when you and I were kids, John, before the internet was really a thing, we all learned handwriting in school. And we learned how to handwrite a certain way. And left-handed people have to sort of compromise and twerk themselves in a certain direction to be able to write in the way that all the right-handed children were taught to write. So
Mm,
if you want to solve the problem, now you either have to teach because it's not just the slant of the letters in cursive, it's also writing from left to right. And so
mhm,
if you're going to make it a fair playing field, like you said, one option is you create a uniform writing style that is compromising to both sides, that both sides have to not have an advantage, but it's actually now a
right.
disadvantage for both of them. And hence, what you end up with is a strain on the effort and resources needed to be able to write. And now everybody has more difficulty than they would have. So you've now put a strain on society. The other option is you teach children two ways to write. Here's what the right-handed people write. Here's what the left-handed people write. And you spend 50% of the educational time teaching the right-handed people to write their way and 50% of the time for the left-handed people to write their way. But now what you end up with is a lesser quality of handwriting for everyone. And so,
So
yes, I'm just simply saying that
sol
when you
to
think these
solve
things out,
inefficiencies, yeah, to solve inefficiencies, you're introducing more inefficiencies that may end up even in a worse place, but they're in a higher
yes,
moral domain because you've responded to this moral question. Now,
yeah,
you brought up left-handedness, and I think that was a good practical example of it, but when you get to the realm of queer theory, you have to understand that normal in the domain of what they wanna disrupt is, you'll see its expression in many different ways. So just think about whatever you would naturally resonate with as beautiful. Well, that is a form of oppression to things that don't match some standard ideal of beauty. And if you believe that beauty is a social construct that is arbitrary and built up only to keep certain people in power, then your praxis means that you actually have to go out and advance and promote things that are specifically not beautiful, and you have to denigrate things that have been considered beautiful in the past and you have to point out how anything associated with the systems that upheld those forms of beauty are actually oppressive. And then if people growing up where this battle is happening, they're seeing things that are considered to be beautiful as actually they're wrong and bad, then you start seeing that your society and culture are changing to accommodate this new perspective about things. And I think where we're seeing society break down a little bit is that some of the things that people are saying are social constructs are actually deeply ingrained evolutionary aspects of the human species, and they have other reasons for being considered beautiful or desirable other than how they look on a magazine page or something like that. It may have something to do with very deeply rooted evolutionary biological impulses and tendencies. But that's not to say that there's nothing to be learned from the discourse around that, because many times some of the things that we take for granted or that have dominance are arbitrary or are have been done without consideration of other things. So just like in the whole postmodern critical thing, that you even if you're a rational scientific, it doesn't mean that you find nothing at all of value in the other side. I think it's important to look at what are the impulses that is driving that movement, and then see if there's some merit there, see if there's some value there. But then usually if you're doing that from the rational scientific side, you're going to find solutions. So your prescriptions based on the description of the problem will be prescriptions that are more in line with that rational scientific perspective, rather than prescriptions like you mentioned that may introduce even more inefficiencies that make the problem worse than it started from the beginning. So if you're married to your dogma and your ideology, it makes it harder to respond to these things in a rational way, particularly if you're told that seeing any downside to what you're doing is actually problematic, and so you can only talk good about it, you can't acknowledge where it's failed. That's just going to keep you in a perpetual cycle.
Yeah, when you
Okay.
said like beauty or the opposite of beauty, something's ugly and that's just a social construct, hence taking this to its extreme, we have to rid the world of either of those perspectives. Another example that came to mind is if we don't reward anyone in our society for superior ability and we give everyone in our society participation ribbons for everything, then what
The
you end
whole
up with is
statement, superior ability, is an oppressive construct. You can say maybe different ability, but to say some people's ability makes them better or more capable than other people is an oppressive discourse. So that's I mean, even being that's where the language control becomes so important here, and people start hopping into the discussion to correct you because you've said something that was wrong.
right. But imagine a world, I'm trying to talk to the audience here. Imagine a world where everything is a participation ribbon and no one is awarded any sort of credit for having done something faster, bigger, stronger, better. What do we end up with? Where does that logically end? And it ends up in some space where any sort of progress or achievement isn't worth the effort to go through. And I don't think it's an outcome that anybody wants either.
Right. So that it's a very good point, and you'll find that point in the modern discourse on the question of meritocracy. So it will not be uncommon that you'll be watching some political debate or some talking head news program where somebody comes out either trying to advance and fight for the concept of meritocracy, or to try to denigrate the concept of meritocracy as a social construct that is arbitrary and oppressive to the vast, you know, diversity of ways that people can exist in the world. And so that, but you're talking about where ideology meets reality. If your ideology prevents you from taking advantage of the people who end up being more productive, the people who end up doing more or utilizing whatever resources are there, if you have to cut all of that off so that the entire yard is every blade of grass is the exact same height, you may not have any lows, but you'll also miss the highs. And if you step back, some people will say that this philosophical point is at the root of the vast differences between kind of Western liberal values and socialist Marxist type philosophical perspectives. But
And the only
that's not the debate we want to go into here. We're just
no,
trying
no.
to draw the line between these philosophies and what our present gender debate is.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would wanna say is that I think you need both camps. You need someone to point out that when you speak of what's pretty, and you are denigrating other forms of humanity that aren't that they didn't show up doing anything different other than they are, or they produced, or they whatever it is, whatever. Again, I'm just trying to be sensitive to the topic, but when you deem that something is in some way better than something else, you are affecting the feelings of both sides, good or bad. And we do need a representation in our society that says, hey, whoa, slow down. When you credit this, recognize that you are now explicitly or implicitly saying something else about the other side. And we all need reminders of that awareness. And all we're trying to say here, I think, and you can agree or disagree, is that when these camps are taken to extremes, and we have to sort of wrestle with what that means, where is the extreme, we may end up causing damage. You said maybe if we make every blade of grass the same height, we don't reach the same highs, we don't have the same lows. But I also think it's very reasonable to think that the logical end of that is that the collective grass is lower than the collective grass before you did that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
and then and grass is a poor metaphor for the way that societies advance and progress. So it's just trying to get that you'll see that it's the difference between kind of equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes, which becomes a very critical nexus point in people debating policy over this. But
Yeah.
it's outside of this particular discussion, and I think we can go to the next one. So now that we've seen where the marriage of postmodern relativism and critical theory expresses itself in the academy, and you'll I think you'll agree that these academic ideas have leaked out into the public discourse, where you'll find people who've never read an academic paper using terminology that found its genesis in these particular fields. And so things like intersectionality, microaggressions, they come from and were originally published in papers in the academic literature of critical race theory. And things like gender being a social construct is, things that came out of gender theory, the concept of something being non-binary. All of these things have their philosophic roots in the academy from people who published and thought about and kind of played with ideas of how humanity and society operate, and then found their way into the public discourse. Okay, so let's keep going. So this great gender debate includes these different perspectives. There's other words that and other concepts that you'll have, particularly around language. Now, language becomes very important when you see how modern society operates in the realm of social media. The rational scientific empiric perspective on language is that language describes reality. It evolved alongside humanity according to its needs. It does continue to evolve, but that evolution is a natural organic process. And that is kind of where language is positioned on that rational scientific realm. The postmodern relativist realm says, well, actually, language constructs an individual's reality, because the only way that we have to understand ourselves and our world and each other is through the medium of language. And so that language is actually constructing our conceptions of reality. And so by controlling, by limiting, restricting, or shaping the way that language is done, we are able to actually shape society, because we can shape how people will think about something by shaping the language that they're supposed to use for it, whether good or bad. And this sounds like high in the sky sort of stuff when you look at it, but when you enter the debate on this issue, people will start policing each other's language and getting very critical about how you use language to talk about an issue. You can see that language is clearly a point of conflict in this debate. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, words mean things, and the way in which we articulate ideas and perspectives and feelings is going to impact. And it's one thing when it's, in one specific situation, okay, it meant a little bit here, but then over the course of an entire society, using a different set of words to describe everything about your world will impact. Over the course of time, it makes a significant difference. It's like you met a fork in the road, and you have two paths you can go down, and 20 years later, you are down a completely different path simply based on the way you articulated the idea.
Right. So the rational perspective is going to be very much sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And then the other side is going to be words are violence. And that control of language is even more. It's not only are words violence, but if because there's this activist element to it, if you don't say the right words, that is also a form of violence. So silence is violence. So if you say the wrong thing, that's violence. If you don't say the right thing, that's violence. And it creates a world where there's this always this impulse where you have to fall in line with the right thing to say. You can't be silent or reticent about an issue, or else you're a bad person. And you'll find it popping up where people are like, well, how come this person hasn't said anything about this particular issue? Well, what are they going to just allow this type of oppression to exist? And the thing is, the narratives about what constitute oppression, the narratives about what constitute harm, those things are born out of which philosophy you're rooted in. So if you're rooted in a critical theory philosophy, you're going to find harm and find oppression that arises from looking at the world through that lens. And it's very different from the rational scientific empiric perspective, which tries to draw a close distinction between actual physical harm and language. So if you say you're going to do something, it's very different than actually doing it. And there are areas where this line is blurred. And there are also areas where you can acknowledge that words do have an effect on someone. And so it's not to say that people in the rational scientific realm will ever say, well, if you have somebody who's if you have, a spouse or a parent who is consistently verbally abusive to you, well, then you're not really hurt. Like that, they acknowledge that there is human psychology that is affected by words, and it can have very harmful effects. But if you take the idea that words shape your reality, words can do harm, and that if somebody has a bad outcome and you used certain words with them, you are now responsible for their bad outcome. That perspective is one that makes it really hard to shape and hold a society together around, because what it does is it gives anyone the power to turn anyone else into an oppressor by articulating that they subjectively felt harm or experienced harm. And it's kind of like when people say, that there there are real abuse victims. But if somebody comes out and uses a, a fake abuse, well, it hurts everyone, because now the people who have real abuse are not going to be believed. And then the systems that used resources to address that particular abuse were wasted. And it just, you can see that there's extremes that can go to on both sides. And you just want to be cognizant of that. And then just kind of like check yourself wherever you are on either side of this, and realize that you don't want to go to those extremes, or determine for yourself where that line is.
Yeah, what I hear is that there is truth and we'll use the words that, again, we're talking language here, but there is truth that saying things insensitively or saying things because you're so sure your view is right when in reality something else is more true, you can in effect cause harm to people. That's not being debated. And if as a society we go, well, you know what? We're going to operate on that truth. So we're going to make everything as neutral as we can. You will you will cause society to tear itself from the inside out.
And on that issue of you can say things that cause harm, the way that you prescribe this is different based on which route you have. So for on the example of microaggressions, right? That's one that you'll frequently heard of as a way that causes just a little bit of stress in a minority person's life. And over time, it's going to shorten their lifespan and be like smoking a certain number of packs of cigarettes per day. Well, you can look at that issue and you could say, okay, well, we as a society could respond to that by trying to control all of the unintentional microaggressions on one segment of society. Or we can teach the people who are experiencing microaggressions to realize and reconceptualize what those microaggressions represent, so that it does not affect them as badly. And this is where cognitive behavioral therapy, which looks at the way that our mind kind of takes in stimuli from the world and then based on some, core evolutionary things that our minds have operated on with fear and anxiety and all these other things, distorts those things and causes us to respond negatively to it. Well, cognitive behavioral therapy tries to get you to examine your thought processes, see where some things may be internal to you and not necessarily intended from the outside world, and then come to understand them in a way that does not traumatize you as much. And so you become more resilient and you can become less subject to other people's, minor incursions on that question of microaggressions. Whereas if you teach someone to not only, feel the microaggressions, but then they have to call out the person and problematize the microaggression, and they should be looking for more things that could potentially be microaggressions. Well, then you just take that programming in the life of an individual, and it's going to increase their anxiety. But then the solution is to look for more things that do end up increasing their anxiety. And then social cohesion breaks down because everybody is afraid of offending everybody else, and it's a program that tends to dissolve relationships rather than build them up. Okay, if we go to the next section one. So on the issue of gender, this question of language and reality draws a dividing line because you have the conventional view where language, including terms like male and female and man and woman, describe some form of concrete reality, whereas the gender theory view sees them as language that we use that shapes and is part of the social construction of our reality. And so there's this line of thinking on the question of gender that started with Simone de Beauvoir, who said that a woman is not born, she's created through the process of socialization and what society determines a proper good woman is. And then you find that notion expanded upon by Judith Butler, and the idea that gender is a performance, and it's a performance that shapes itself in the context of a social structure which determines what it is, and tends to confine women to a particular role. But it doesn't have to be that way. And so, what we're going to do to represent these different perspectives is kind of consider them an ideological lens. So, you can look at any of the various issues that get hotly debated on this matter through a set of glasses that has a particular tint that maybe we'll call the conventional view or the rational empiric view. And then you can also look at them from the perspective of this gender theory view, which is rooted in that postmodern critical theory sort of world where language becomes very important and where society is full of constructs that are inherently arbitrary but have existed to uphold systems of power and normality. And when you realize that these two different perspectives, these two different ideological lenses exist, then you can start to see where debate is coming from different perspectives, and then how they end up clashing. So you have the conventional view, which is that trans women are men. So that's the idea that people who may biologically be men, but later decide that their gender identity is that of a woman. Well, if you're a conventional person, rational scientific person, you are going to say, well, no, that's not right because they're actually men. So they're just men identifying as women, and then all the downstream consequences of that. So that makes rational sense if you're starting from that conventional scientific empiric perspective. But if you start from the postmodern perspective that sees these things like gender as social constructs that have been built up to keep people in power and are arbitrary, and so they can be reshaped and reformed by reconceptualizing the language, well, then very much you could say that trans women are women, and you can be rational in doing it because all of the assumptions that go into your statement, they have an internal logical consistency about them. And if that doesn't make sense to you right now, we're going to see exactly where that consistency comes from. But by asserting that trans women are women, then when you argue that trans women should be allowed in women's sports, you're saying that women are women and we shouldn't be cutting off a segment of women and treating them differently because we want to be magnanimous in how we're treating people and seeing them as equals. And so it's very possible to see how, depending on which set of lenses that you're wearing, you're going to see these issues in a very different way. So the great gender debate is not actually about gender, because the way you're going to see gender is going to depend on the ideology that you come to the discussion with. It's really a debate about whatever the competing ideology is, whether it's this conventional scientific view or the postmodern relativist view. So these debates online are really debates not about prisons and sports teams. It's a battle of ideas about how to conceive and conceptualize the world. And this battle gets played out in social media and in the media in general by word games. And that is because a lot of the words that you're using when you're arguing for things carry assumptions that are derived from the philosophy that you're starting the whole discussion with. And then you end up using your own set of definitions for what you're arguing about with somebody who's using a completely different set of assumptions and definitions about what they're arguing about. And it could be for very simple terms such as man and woman. Do you see that this is playing out where these battles are really about ideas and they get fought through the medium of words?
Uh, yes, and my mind immediately goes to the fact that we've created this competing thing of these 2 camps, and there really are so many other factors that are affecting this too. For instance, I don't think that, say, religious orthodoxy, the right-wing religious side, is deeply affecting this conversation, and I don't find them to cleanly fit in either of those 2 camps. They're a separate set of things that are coming to this discussion that are affecting it. And you and I can go like, in reality, that camp doesn't, it's basing itself on invisible things that are irrational. It shouldn't even have a place to sort of affect the conversation, but in real time it absolutely is. And so it's sort of hard, I think, for maybe an audience to sort of separate what you and I are talking about and sort of recognize, like, well, there's these other camps that also have impact,
Yeah.
but we're not talking about those here. That's a whole nother issue for another day. And this conversation is so much more complex than even what we're speaking to.
Well, you bring up a very good point in that I'm not trying to say, and no one is trying to say that people only have one ideology. All of us have kind of different sets of assumptions and beliefs that operate within a particular domain. And if we want to be perfectly consistent, we would like to think that none of our systems of belief contradict each other, but we usually end up having overlapping areas. And we end up having a hierarchy where we allow certain aspects of one particular domain of our ideology to override the other, even if there's an inherent contradiction, if we are willing to look at it. And so when I was in the Mormon world, I was very much in kind of a world that was separate from an objective, rational, truth-based realm, but I also, in the realm of science and trying to determine how the world operated, I had a conventional, rational scientific perspective. And these things, our understanding of, our particular glasses, the lenses that we wear changes over time. But I think for any particular issue, you realize there's usually one broad thing that gets born on it. And the other thing about what you said that I think is really important is that you could set another pair of glasses here, which is the fundamentalist religious perspective, which is to say that God said in the Bible that there are two genders, and so that's what I'm going to base my approach of all of this. And then you just say, well, that's another set of glasses that people put on, and that person may even override the conventional view because the conventional rational scientific view has to deal with things like intersex conditions that are not exactly one, stereotypical gender or the other. And whereas the Bible doesn't really have much to say about that. And so you wonder where people that are rooting their entire discourse from that religious fundamentalist perspective.
And the only reason I say that is because as these 2 camps on the screen are discussing and debating ideas, we have to sort of recognize in our head that on that conventional view side, there are other people who are using perhaps at times similar language
Yeah.
or take the same position, but their rationale or their perspective is based on a completely different ideology.
Hmm.
And the postmodern side, at least on this issue, needs to recognize that you can't allow one of those to be seen as meaning the other. They're 2 different camps
Yeah.
that have completely different frameworks for what they're doing, and even if they have some overlap, the motivations and what all goes into those perspectives are entirely different and have to be sort of separated out.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Because if the religious fundamentalist who's got a bunch of wacky ideas about the world is happens to be arguing the same thing that you're arguing, that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that you don't want to have to listen to the whole thing on that. Anyway, so
No.
let's keep going on that. Okay, so this is kind of the question. This is what was coming up again and again in that debate, is that this is how the debate is usually framed. You have sex and you have gender, but the thing that's usually missing is stereotypes. So let's talk about this sex gender thing. So like what would you say is kind of the basic understanding of the difference between sex and gender? And I'm asking you just out of the blue, just because I think that you'll probably have the conventional understanding as it exists in the modern world today.
Yeah, I would say sex is what my outward body presents itself as, and I would say gender is something not so easily defined. Maybe I'm saying it wrong, but gender to me would be how someone identifies. It would be the trouble is I don't have the right language for this, but I do recognize that those are two different terms. Sex seems to be like XX and XY, right? And even I know that people can be XX or XY, and because of how genetics works, they can actually show up biologically different than the chromosome said it should have shown up. So there are, I don't want to, anomalies is the right word, but it sort of also then again marginalizes somebody, right? You're an anomaly. But
Yeah.
there
Well,
are ways that there are square pegs that do fit into round holes when it comes to genetics and how we see things express themselves.
I think those are all really good observations. When was the first time that you encountered the idea that somebody's gender can be determined by what they identify as? Because that is a conception that is very common and it's very much rooted in the postmodern perspective. Is that something that you grew up understanding, or is that something you encountered and then evaluated and said, okay, now I'm going to consider that as part of my calculation of gender?
Yeah, probably my 30s.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a relatively new realization of the concept of gender. Now, it used to be that sex, like a long time ago, and you can actually pull up a biology textbook from like the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they talk about sex and they'll say that it's determined by the gamete, which would be whichever of the sexual items is bigger is the ovum and the other one is the sperm. And there's actually evolutionary reasons why that you need one of the genetic things to be mobile and the other one not, and carrying the cytoplasm versus just the DNA itself. But there's reasons for that. And so sex was considered to be something that was seen as being defined by what gametes you produced. And then gender was equivalent to sex in most terms, but gender was something that was also applied to linguistic constructs in various languages that evolved that had gendered terms for certain things. So that's kind of the old notion. And what you described was very much a new notion in this long-term thinking where you have sex, which is somehow what you are rooted in the concrete real world, and then you have gender, which is tied into some innate sense of being as it operates within society. Now, you've probably heard the idea that blue is boy and pink is girl, and that would probably be seen as somehow tied to gender because we tend to, and before this discourse got to the point it is now, that's kind of what the norms were in our western world, but it was arbitrary. There's nothing inherently girl about pink or masculine about blue, and you can look back in history and you can find moments in time where a society for whatever reason found pink to be the masculine color. And so there's something that exists outside of this sex gender paradigm that usually gets missing from these debates, and that is stereotype. And so this triad of sex, gender, and stereotype are different words that end up carrying different assumptions based on where you start philosophically on all of this. And so we have sex, which tends to be biological, where you can have something that is either male or female, acknowledging that there are intersex conditions that are a minority, that are very rare, that don't disrupt that bimodal distribution and need to be accounted for. But the conventional use of the term sex is for the bimodal distribution of our existence as a sexual species that reproduces sexually and has evolved through the sexual reproduction. Then you have language, which is how we express and tend to kind of on a day-to-day deal with that. And that is usually you'll use the term man or woman. And then we have culture, which is masculine or feminine. And by making sure that we're including masculine and feminine as a part of our analysis, I think it'll make the differences become a little bit clearer, because that concept of stereotypical masculine feminine tends to not enter into the debate. And so it clouds the differences that are actually going on between what people are talking about. So
Mm.
you'll there's this famous documentary out there called What is a Woman? And Matt Walsh goes around and tries to get people to define what a woman is. And it seems to be very difficult because you know, that term is become so central in this discourse, because if you look at man or woman simply being a linguistic expression of a biological reality, then you could say that a man is an adult human male and a woman is an adult human female. And none of those terms that are used in the definition of woman are recursive or circular. They're talking about different aspects of the person you're using the word man or woman for. And that makes sense. Whereas if you start from the postmodern social construction relativist perspective, then you'll say a woman is whoever identifies as a woman, and they should be treated as such in social construct. And you could ask that question that I asked of you a moment ago, is like, well, when did you first encounter that idea? Where did that idea come from? And then go back and just trace the genealogy of that idea. That's a woman is who identifies as a woman, and you'll find that it finds its most earliest and fullest expression in academic literature around gender and queer theory, and some of these postmodern constructivist ideas about how society operates. And that's not to say it's wrong or bad. It's just to say these ideas have roots. They come from places, and it's okay to understand where they come from and just realize that you're operating from that set of assumptions. Okay, so where is the social construct in this? Because I think we'll both acknowledge, and both rational scientific as well as postmodern perspectives will acknowledge there are social constructs. It's just, what do you consider to be a social construct? If you consider stereotype, so pink being something associated with femininity and blue being associated with masculinity, that's a social construct. It's arbitrary. You'll find different expressions of that in different societies just based on their local milieu. And that's kind of the conventional view. Stereotypes are socially constructed. And so you could have a biological male who feels a great affinity with the things that are stereotypically female. But if they hold the conventional view, they would say, I'm biologically a male, I'm still a man. I just identify with and most resonate with all of the things that, for whatever reason, my society considers to be feminine. And so that is my mode of outward expression. Okay, so then you have the gender theory view, which draws a different line on social construction. And it says that gender, using the phrase man or woman, as well as stereotype, are all socially constructed. And rigidly, then the sex itself is not socially constructed. There is a biological reality that. Now, this gets muddied because if you go back and you read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, she'll say that gender is performative, but then a few pages later, there's some statements that even draw some ambiguity as to whether or not they believe that sex itself is also a social construct. And so that's kind of one of those things that maybe that's a little bit too far. People don't talk too much about that idea, but you'll find it out there where people will say that it's not just that man or woman is a social construct, it's that male and female are also a social construct. And so that's where people are using languages that carry assumptions that you just want to be clear about. Okay, so the question that comes in understanding the differences from these two perspectives is, where do you anchor your definition of gender? And this becomes very important, because if you're going to call someone a woman or a man, then there's a set of criteria that you have for what constitutes a woman or man. And that criteria represents where you anchor the definition of that word. And because that word then gets written into law about where men and women are allowed to be and how we treat men and women, then where you anchor that definition has implications all the way down the line. And so if you're going to go with the conventional view, then your definition of gender is anchored in your biological reality, your biological constituency, understanding that there are minor exceptions where there are ambiguous sexual developments that then some decision ends up getting made. It's a form of legal fiction, but it operates within a broader social environment that is rooted in the bimodal distribution of human biological sexuality. So then you have gender theory, and what gender theory ends up doing when you go back and look at it is that it ends up anchoring its definition of gender in stereotype. So that if you, that man who was born male but identifies with all the things that are stereotypically feminine, if they hold this gender theory perspective, they'll say, well, even though I have the biological constituency of a man, the word woman is defined by what I resonate with, what feels right to me. And so I am a woman because a woman as a term does not describe a biological reality. It describes a social construct within a society. And that is what defines me as a woman. So it's a difference in definition that can, I've tried to find out how can I most clearly articulate it, and what I've come up with is just where do you anchor that definition? And that anchor for the gender theory view is in the stereotypes. So you can look then at the ways that people can show up, and where you anchor it then very much determines how you look at the world of gender and its expression in society. So we've got three different categories here. This is the conventional view. So we've anchored our definition of man and woman in sex. Okay, so you have a male or a female if you're looking at the biological reality, and that's equivalent to gender in the conventional view. So a male will grow up to be a man and a female will grow up to be a woman. But then you have this social construct, which is stereotypes. And so you may have a man who fits all of the stereotypes of masculinity that exist as social constructs within a society, and he'll be a masculine man. He'll be a very manly man. But you may find a man that, for whatever reason, resonates with, identifies with, and wants to exist in society with all of the things that are traditionally and stereotypically associated with femininity, with womanhood. And so, if this individual has not adopted the queer theory perspective, but adopts the conventional view, they'll say that they are a feminine man, or they are a man that wants to operate in society, inhabiting and living in all the stereotypical ways that are traditionally feminine or traditionally associated with a woman, but that does not change that they are a man or male. And by the same token, someone born female will grow up to be a woman. And if they end up identifying with and having all the inclinations that are traditionally masculine, then they will be seen or see themselves as a masculine woman, or conversely, a feminine woman if everything that they resonate with is with what are traditionally in a society stereotypically female. I want to step back and say historically, there are some social realities that gave rise to the gender theory view, which is that society, us as evolutionary creatures and social creatures, have not treated people who are differently very well. And so all of those social norms and stereotypes, even if they're coded as kind of a way that people know what their role is in society and everything like that, people have always existed who did not conform to those stereotypes, and society treated them poorly. And so, from this conventional view, you can historically look back and say, people who were gender non-conforming, if we understand gender being matching the socially constructed stereotypes, were treated poorly in the past. And so we do need to change as a society. But our change needs to be that we need to be more accepting of people who are gender non-conforming. And we need to be less oppressive towards somebody, the traditional one would be like somebody who wants to wear dresses or skirts or wants to wear makeup even though they have traditional masculine biology or something like that. You just need to broaden your conception of what a man can be. You can have a feminine man who is so inhabiting things that are stereotypically female that you may not even be able to realize that. But again, what the person conceives of themselves of in the world as either a trans woman or a feminine man is going to be determined in their head by what set of ideas and assumptions they bring to their self-conception. And so that, again, this is not to say that this is the right way. This is a way that is rooted in assumptions about biological reality and language and stereotypes, and just what that implications of that are. So, with that being said, on this one, we're going to look at now the gender theory view. Do you have anything you want to mention about this?
Only that in trying to explain this in a simple way to folks, and I know you would grant this, we're still splitting these things up into sort of black and white terms. Because when you look at like feminine man, that might apply to transgender, that might apply to homosexual. I've seen heterosexual men who have an extreme amount of femininity to them, to the point
No,
where
no,
I
good.
started on the front end and assumed that they were gay when in fact they were married and had been married for 20 years and would tell you that they are as heterosexual as can be, and yet they hold the position in their expression as being very feminine. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, but the point you make is good. These are about gender and stereotypes and biology. This has nothing to do with sexuality. Like sexuality is a whole separate dimension that you can look at, and there are some loose connections with. But as you mentioned, you cannot assume that somebody who is a feminine man is gay. Now, statistically, you could look at populations and you could say, well, it's more likely or something like that. But this is not a discussion of that at all, and no assumptions should be made on that. But that's part of why this discourse gets muddied because people will say, well, the LGBTQ community, the LGBTQ community wants this, the LGBTQ community wants that. Well, LG and B are dealing with sexuality, and Q is dealing with these questions of identity and gender and society in ways that your sexuality doesn't determine that you will think the same way about these things. But that we'll get to some of those questions in the coming slides. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. So now we're going to leave that conventional theory, and we're going to say now actually stereotype and gender are both social constructs, and our definition of what constitutes a woman or a man is actually rooted in those stereotypes within a particular social milieu. And so we'll start out with somebody that may be born male or female. And if they happen to be masculine or feminine as a male or both, then you've got some options. So if you have somebody who's purely a masculine male, then they are a man because you've rooted your definition in the stereotype. If you have someone who is happens to be born biologically female, but they are biologically male, but they are feminine, then and purely feminine, then they are a woman because you're defining woman by which social constructs you identify most with. And we're including the stereotype having to do with the gender as that social construct. And so you are a woman because we define woman that way. And if you have both masculine and feminine or a little bit of both, then you are non-binary. Or if you don't resonate with any of them and you see yourself as something other than that, then non-binary is an exclusive term that is basically you're not looking at the world in terms of man or woman, and you want to exist outside of all of the stereotypes and assumptions that get bundled into those phrases, man and woman. And so it's more complex as a diagram, but you can see that when you have the biological male that identifies purely with the opposite side and wants to be a woman in how they exist in social discourse and in society, that's where we have the trans identity. And then that's different from the non-binary identity. Now, you mentioned that this really is something that exists in three dimensions, and there's many more conceptions than what seems to be kind of a double binary idea here. And so there is another dimension that has made its way into the discourse, and it's something that we've already alluded to that really does blow up all of these fancy charts with rigid lines that connect one to another, and that is identity and the expansive concept of identity that we're starting to see really capture the minds of the next generation, of even our institutions at the government and societal levels. And that is identity can trump everything. Some people have called this gender abolition because what they want to say is that identity is really the thing that matters. And humans are pretty much a blank slate beyond that. And there's no real differences that are biological between men and women. All the differences that we've previously said are rooted in the biology of man and woman are really socially constructed and socially programmed. And so, the idea that as a man, you know, like this John Delen's podcast recently on human sexuality, included some of these assertions that men are programmed that it's okay to be horny, but it's not okay to need emotional connection or want to cuddle, and so that's just the programming that they're forced to do. Where we don't have to follow that programming, you can expand it. And so people who see men and women as interchangeable in that way have more of a justification for saying that identity really trumps everything. And regardless of whether you're biologically male or female, regardless of whether or not you match to any degree what society says is masculine or feminine, whatever you identify as is the thing that defines you. So you could be a big burly guy with a beard, never had any surgery, never had any hormones, but you choose to identify as a woman, then from this perspective, that is how you are a woman, because all of the assumptions that go into this define what a woman is. And so by saying you're the woman with that definition, you're consistent, you're rational, and you are basing it on some philosophical ideas that have their roots in the academy and in the past. But every idea has its root in the past. And so you can rationalize it that way. And by the same thing, you mentioned somebody who doesn't identify with any sort of gender, and that's where the non-binary stuff is. And you can take this and see how there may be radical extremes that don't work so much because we're only talking about man, woman, non-binary. There's a community called Therians that identify as non-human animals. There's movements that build up entire, internal rational thought about their identity, starting from this point that make it very expansive. So when you see things like xenogenders or novel genders that are not rooted in some historical tradition that humans have, it's an expression of this identity being the thing that trumps all. This is where the debate has led us to. And if you pay attention to the way the laws are being shaped in Europe, which is a few years ahead of us, there's a great deal of fight being put in something called gender self ID. And what gender self ID says is pretty much that as long as you've filled out a form and made the application to declare yourself a particular gender, there is no gatekeeping. There's no requirement that you've had any surgery, hormones, lived with anything. As long what you identify as is what you are, and then the government is bound to treat you legally as that type of entity. And so all of these games about words seem playful and fun, and they give you new ways to look at the world. But when you go to the intersection of this language games and law, which is rooted in language and has to operate based on words, you kind of need consistent definitions that everyone knows when the laws were formed, this is what this word means. Because if you go changing the definition of the word, you're actually changing what the law represents in society. And that's why there's so much debate and discussion about this. And you can Google out there and see where the instances where this law has led to some outcomes that people are reconsidering the wisdom of implementing this law. Because as much as we want to entertain and explore these ideas, this whole postmodern relativist conception of gender still represents a minority view. Even though they're the loudest, most people, numerically speaking, are still kind of rooted in that rational empiric world. It's just that this new conception of gender is the loudest, the most active, because it's also married to that praxis dimension where you have to be an activist and you have to, in essence, kind of proselytize this. We end up hearing a lot about it. And when you operate in social media, when you start to hear a lot of different things again and again and over again, you start to think that that's the majority. And we all know that there are very strong social gears in our head that tend to want us to kind of go along with what is seen as the social norm. And there's that social conformity test that points out that aspect of human psychology. But this is just to say gender theory 2.0 is rooted in identity, and it blows away all the other considerations because identity becomes the primary thing, and that matches what you talked about. Okay, anything to say on that?
Man, I have lots of thoughts, and I have no confidence that I would be able to put them into words to articulate ideas. I will say, as you went into this section, my mind was pulled back to the earlier section of just noting to the audience when you're hearing all of this stuff explained, you should be going, "Oh, I can really feel this conventional world in this postmodern relativism world sort of clashing as it tries to figure out how to maintain some sort of societal continuity while also going, hey, we probably haven't been the best in the past at acknowledging things that don't fit into binary ideas, which the world never was anyway. And hence, how do we make more space for people who have been left out, marginalized, traumatized, and help them to have an equal chance to have positive outcomes in the world as the rest of us?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the debate of our age, and I think we are in the process of making sense of it. And some of these things, because the critical social justice perspective starts out with using phrase like empathy and oppression and the oppressed and standing up for the oppressed, it carries that really empathetic seed that makes you want to see things from that perspective, and it's very easy to go along with that. And what they're seeing as they've taken this to what some people say is too far as an extreme in this gender self ID. You and I could sit there and we could look at what's happened in the religious realm where we'd see that people who are predators would selectively kind of go into situations where they know they can either groom an environment or take advantage of vulnerabilities that will give them access to the things that they are inclined to prey upon. And so if you say, okay, well, now we're going to have a legal rule that says if you identify as something, then the law has to treat you like that, then one side of the debate will say, okay, well, then if a prisoner who committed a violent sexual crime identifies as a woman, then we have to put her in the same prison as women because the law says women go into a women segregated prison. And so this is one of the things that caused a great deal of debate because people who are trying to fight for women's right will point out that the over what like ridiculous majority of violent sexual offenses are committed by biological males. And that women who are in prison generally it's a very very small percentage of them that are in there for violent sexual crimes. But if you take that overwhelming majority of violent sexual males, give them a legal avenue through which they can have access to further victims, some percentage of them are going to take advantage of it. And you could say, well, we've seen that in other domains where people who have predatory proclivity will take advantage of systems in order to gain access to vulnerable people. And so you say, if that argument on the question of this self ID in prisons doesn't carry any weight, then are you saying that there are going to be nobody who exploits a system like that to gain access to people that they would say are their vulnerable prey? Or even if they just want to escape the harsher conditions of the male prison. Like, what is this that's going to do if you have a bunch of people who are inherently more violent? Because statistically, again, there's more of these violent people in prison who have committed violent crimes, and so are more likely to have that be a risk factor. These are social things that you have to struggle with. And now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the right answer is to keep things the way they are. And that's where, as a society, we're experimenting with what does this mean? Does this mean we need to have a separate prison facility for people who have identified as something different? And do we need to expand that even further? And that's where I think, we'll see where these things go. But your hypothetical about trying to fix one inefficiency by introducing a bunch of other inefficiencies may end up in a worse condition than before. That's kind of what we have to struggle with. And the other question is, this is talking about different ideologies, different ways of thinking about the world that people can have. And as a free society that wants the freedom of thought, we need to make sure that we don't react to differences of thought in a way that clamps down the ability for a society to be free, to think different ways, and to advocate publicly for different ways. So if you've watched my YouTube channel, I've been putting up congressional hearings where people on both sides of this issue will try to present their argument to lawmaking bodies as to whether or not something is to be considered illegal or allowed. And that, like, my position is not that we need to completely make all of this stuff illegal and not allow anyone to see this way, that we need to stamp out transgenderism or anything like that. I think those types of responses are the types that take away the freedom that we need as a society. And we need to understand that we may not know everything is right. And so we need to allow the discourse to happen where people are free to talk on both sides of this issue. And then we use our democratic principles just to adjudicate how we are going to shape our society. You and I would probably not want some religious minority faction to have their ideology make its way through our democratic processes and become the dominant ideology, where they then take their ideology, translate it into laws, and impose it on wider society. And so we just have to pay attention and make sure that our democratic processes don't get overrun and overtaken by groups that aren't respecting the democratic principle of, adjudicating these things in the public debate forum that allows everybody to examine all sides of an issue and then come up with, the best possible decision that we can make, and then be open to revising it in the future. And that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, and I'll just say when you were going through this, before you got to talking about prisons, that's the very example I was thinking of. That in this postmodern relativism view, where we want to make sure that those who identify as transgender are treated just as kindly, have just as safe space to be their brand of human, what you do is you allow, as you point out, predators to, again, if I was either a predatory male, or I simply, like you said, wanted to ensure, if I'm a criminal, I'm a constant criminal and I want to secure that if I do get caught, I have the easier treatment in prison. I'm going to go fill out the paperwork and identify myself as a woman. Now I go to prison, and by the postmodern relativist view, trying to protect the rights of transgender people, what you've now done is sacrificed the
Mhm.
vulnerability of the biologically female, identify as female population. And so, by trying to do one good in the world, which is sincere and genuine, and we should be giving emphasis to that point of view in terms of listening to it and
Mhm.
weighing in on what the credibility of that argument is, and trying to help people have safe spaces to be their expression of human so long as they don't hurt people. What you in effect did was take another segment of human beings and actually put them as vulnerable to being
Yeah.
marginalized, traumatized, hurt, and harmed.
Yeah, yeah, that is, you put your finger right on the issue, and this is why on the issue, on the question of sports, on the question of prisons, on the question of rape shelters, there's so much heated debate on this. It's because if these changes didn't affect anyone else, then people wouldn't really care. But they tend to infringe upon things that we have as a society historically found good cause to have gendered segregation because of differences that are innate to our existence as human creatures that deal with a gender that tends not to be as violent or aggressive or physically strong and imposing, that has good reason for the differences in which we treat these gender. And but the thing is, everything that you just said will get you in trouble. Like the fact that you assume that somebody who identifies as trans is going to be more violent or is going to try to game the system, that in and of itself is proof of your bigotry. Now, you could counter where you say, listen, I just know humans will tend to exploit systems that they're in for their own benefit. That's just a human thing that doesn't have anything to do with gender
Yeah.
identity at
No.
all. But people won't listen to that because they'll say that the practical result of what you said is to continue to marginalize a historically marginalized group. And so that dogmatic, rigid way of only looking at your particular interests or your particular activist paradigm without considering everything else gets infused into it. But there's reason for it though, because what are women? What are these women you're trying to protect? These women that you're trying to protect are cis women. They have historically been dominant. Society has given them the benefit of everything forever. So you're asking for the historically marginalized one to yet again have to surrender to the dominant woman. And this stuff goes like on this question of the rights of women versus the rights of men and what constitutes a woman. Even like lesbians are having to fight this battle where there's a movement of lesbians that are still rooted in kind of that conventional perspective that have not adopted gender identity or queer theory as their philosophical background to this question, who are then in a world where if they say, you know what, I am not sexually attracted to some person who is biologically male, whether they have a penis or not, that is considered bigotry because it's continuing to marginalize a historically marginalized thing for this question of gender. And
Right. You
so,
don't have a right to be attracted to what you're attracted to.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so people have even said, okay, let's play with these rules. We're fine. We're going to say these rules. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another gender, a new gender, and I'm going to call it super straight. And what super straight is that I'm only sexually attracted to other biological beings of the opposite sex from me. And that's we're going to let everybody be whatever gender they want to be, but now I identify as super straight. So what they were trying to do, it was kind of a parody, but what it was doing is it was saying, okay, we're going to accept all of these different assertions that you've laid into our discourse, but then we're going to expand on it just as you've expanded on everything else. And that way we'll carve out a space for us to exist. And that was immediately branded as transphobic, as hateful and bigoted, and you will get shouted down on the internet. But you can just Google super straight and see how that was trying to be done, because these people who feel like all of these activists who are championing marginalized causes from this perspective see that it's their moral imperative to even all of the objections that you raised, to further problematize those and make sure that what they want gets through at the societal institutional level. And it's hard to push back against it because you get called a bigot, you get called hateful, and we're creatures that thrive on social acceptance. There's strong evolutionary roots that cause us want to be accepted by our tribe, and it's really difficult to deal with being canceled by your tribe, but that's what you lie yourself open to by pushing back on any of this, because they can always say you don't want to care for the marginalized.
Yeah. The only other thing I want to add here is I want to bring religion in for just a moment, and I just want to make the audience aware. Religion, as much based on irrational ideas, and as much as it uh, has unhealthy rules and boundaries, it's the what religion does is it solves the problem in a different way. It comes in and it goes, oh, like, so by the way, at the head of a religion are privileged voices. Those voices love the power and authority they have. And by placing all of the rules in God's mouth, there's this being who's out there in the universe, and these aren't my rules. They happen to privilege me, but they're not my rules. They're his rules. It allows the debate to end. Like, right, the thinking has been done. God has done it. God's laid out the rules. This is how it works. And so it solves this problem of us having to constantly be self-aware that in order to make meaning, we've created a binary world that it doesn't really exist. In reality, it's this wide spectrum of all kinds of human expression. And but we don't have to think about any of it because God's laid it out. It is a binary world. Here are the rules. Play by them. Don't argue with me. If you argue with me, here's the penalty. And hence the privileged voices don't have to say, like, my opinion matters more than you simply because I say it does. They get to place that in the voice of a supreme being in the universe who's in control of everything. And I just want the audience to recognize that religion does create some continuity in society, even if it's based on the unhealthiest of ideas and the most irrational of beliefs. It does sort of solve the problem and keep us from having to dig into this and debate it at a really deep level.
Yeah, I've heard people say that for all of its defects and flaws, religion sort of serves as an antivirus to radical ideas that pop up from time to time that may ultimately end up destroying a society through just changing the rules of civil discourse such that people can't actually come together in any sort of mutual project, but rather disintegrates a society. And some people have said that the fight over this, which people, exists as a fight over things like transgender rights and everything, but it's really a fight between those different ideological, philosophical foundations about how we understand the world. And so it's just, I think it's worth reflecting on, how do you approach this issue? How do you want to think about the implications of a certain position that you might advocate for? And so that's kind of the background that I want to bring to this. And I think we're
Yeah.
getting close to the end, but let's go to, now that we understand that. So it's not a debate about sex and gender. It's a debate about ideology. And you have that conventional view where language describes reality, gender is anchored in sex, stereotypes are socially constructed, and therefore trans women are men. And you have the gender theory view, which is that language shapes our reality. Gender is anchored in stereotypes and is socially constructed. Therefore, trans women are women. And it's a difference that really comes down to what is socially constructed, where are the definitions anchored. And there are a couple of questions that you might ask yourself as you ponder this. One of them is, are there stereotypes that are not purely social constructs? And so I asked you earlier, blue being masculinity, pink being femininity. I think that's something that's like purely a social construct. It's very arbitrary. There's no inherent biological reason that that might be the case. But then there are other stereotypes that might not just be a social construct. So the idea that men are stronger and larger than women. Is there any biological basis for that? Is there any evolutionary reality that might cause that to be a reality. And it's not, yes, it is a stereotype. We make those assumptions, but it's a stereotype that has some anchor in a biological reality, or in a reality that is reflective of the world as it exists in its material form.
Right, not
And
entirely an arbitrary construct.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, they can be shaped in the way that we can understand them, and there can be outliers. But, these things tend to be stereotypes because they reflect some sort of generalization. And so you have to be open to things, and try to discern things that are really arbitrary. So things like colors and clothing may be arbitrary, and people could choose, and we should, as a society, be open to people presenting publicly in very different ways and very wide ways. We've assumed that things like professions are actually also socially constructs, and we just we give women the idea that they have to be a certain type of person their whole life, and so when it comes time to choose a profession, that's what they do, plus all the men have this particular job and they keep the women out. Like, those are assumptions that, when you look at societies that have a lesser degree of those rigid social roles that they impose on people from the beginning, there is a weird phenomenon where there's even more of a divide in what the genders end up doing. And people observe that for some reason, women tend to gravitate towards or have an affinity for professions that are centered more around people and relationship and caring and nurturing, whereas men tend to be gravitate more towards professions that are more about objects and things. And these are broad generalizations. They don't say that neither gender has the capacity to do the opposite of what happens. They are just a reflection of what ends up happening. Then you could say, well, is there any evolutionary reason why the human species may have evolved so that those tendencies tend to be grouped and clustered in those particular sexes? And I think that if you see that one of the undeniable differences between men and women is the capacity to become pregnant and to give birth. It's an important function for our species, and it is in the domain of women exclusively. And so the upbringing of young children is also part of that. So, people who've looked at this from an evolutionary psychology perspective will say, to claim that the only differences between men and women are purely social constructs is to deny biological and evolutionary reality. And that, just knowing that that's a debate that's out there, I think is helpful. So when you hear somebody assert one thing or the other, you just realize that there may be some question about that. Some people say that, oh, the science is settled on all of these issues. That's not necessarily always the case.
Yeah,
So one of
I just wanna
what
say yeah, I just wanna say, and maybe I'm getting off in the weeds here, you pointed this out. If men are bigger, faster, stronger, and now and women are able to get pregnant and carry the perpetuation of the species, now recognize how those 2 concepts may have over millions of years affected why women seem to be more caring and empathetic, more concerned about people, for instance, and men seem to be more aggressive or whatever other traits we want to say, that having one side of the species be bigger, faster, stronger is going to impact how the other species recognizes the harm that's being caused to people in
Mhm.
general, for instance, right? So
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
these concepts are millions of years in the making, and we've only sort of touched the surface in any conversation we have with another person of being self-aware about what all brings all of this to the table in this moment as we talk this out. And some of this can't be changed. It
Right.
would take millions of years for even if we intentionally bred humans to root out these things, you would take millions of years to root it out to some degree that it was even hyper noticeable, right? That
Yeah,
so
exactly.
some of this you can't avoid.
It's kind of like calling back to that whole question about beauty. What does society determine as beauty? Now, if there's any element of what men historically and traditionally understand to be desirable in a sexual partner, and if those traits of desirability are rooted in the evolutionary process that selects for health, that selects for the things that would then promote some form of evolutionary advantage, then to try to shape society by disrupting certain aspects of beauty and try to impose a new framework of beauty in a society through this way of looking at the world where language constructs reality and we can shape man into the ideal creature by constructing the language and constructing society, well, then you're trying to fight against very, very strong evolutionary powers. And chances are you won't be successful. So, with that being said, if you want to know more about this world of differences between male and female, there's a couple of presentations that I think are a good opener. There's one called "The Biology of Sex and Gender" by Heather Hayne.
After
You'll find
school.
it on the yeah, you'll find it on the
Yeah.
After School channel. It's a great just eye opener about, and she's looking not at just the human species but other sexually reproductive species and just the concept of sexual reproduction. Because when you study evolution and biology, sexual reproduction as a phenomenon among species is something that has evolved right along with the lineage that led up to humanity. And there's a lot of implications and things to understand about that. There's another book called The End of Gender by Deborah So, who is looking at a lot of the peer-reviewed literature on the differences between men and women that seem to transcend social reconstruction and are inherent to our evolutionary existence as sexed creatures. There's a couple of other textbooks that you could go and dig into to see where the rational scientific world finds these differences that are not social constructs, but still divide humanity into this bimodal distribution of men and women, and say that there's some reason that you can have some confidence in a lot of what is said there. Now, that's different from saying that we need to have society only rigidly treat men and women in very particular ways. Because remember, the beauty of what the awakening of some of the postmodern ideas is that it allows us to realize where we may be too rigid in some aspects of how society is shaped. But it's very different to expand the realm of what you could conceive a man to be, for example, versus redefining woman so that it's inclusive of a different, a gender non-conforming man. Those are two perspectives that you're starting with, and one of them is the one that's exists currently and has evolved over society, and the other one is the fruit of a new way of thinking about the world that may or may not have the ability to incorporate itself into our society and to expand the way our society works. But people come up with new ideas and new ways of thinking about the world all the time, and we just have to parse through it. So if you want to see more about this postmodern conception of gender and men and women, there's a bunch of books that you can go to. You can look at Gendered Trouble by Judith Butler. You can look at Deviations by Gail S. Rubens, The Epistemology of the Closet and the History of Sexuality. And a lot of these are considered founding texts or are from figures that are founding figures in the realm of queer theory. Now, remember, I said that queer theory is really about looking at the oppressive nature of things that are considered normal and expanding your conception of possibilities to realize that we don't have to confine ourselves to what people think is normal and that there's an oppressive dimension to that. And so if you're in a debate with someone or if somebody says that they are queer, some of the questions that I think are worth pondering are: is queer a biological material reality that somebody's born with, or is queer a political identity that is a collection of ideas and beliefs about how the world should work that then carries an activist dimension to it? And so if it's the latter, then it may be that the way that the questions that you might ask are going to be different, and the assumptions that you might have are different. The other question to ask is, if somebody has based their worldview on disrupting normality, where are the outer limits of that? Because you could say that if we're going to say nothing should be considered abnormal, nothing should be seen as strange or weird, and we need to normalize all of this strange, weird stuff, then things start to happen. And just as we talked about, where predators can make their way into certain physical spaces because they have access to their vulnerable targets, there are people who may resonate with a particular set of ideas because it perhaps normalizes and facilitates things that no one else will normalize or facilitate. So you can look at the writings of Judith Butler, and she disrupts and dismantles gender for sure, but she also disrupts and dismantles some other taboos, such as the incest taboo. And she'll pepper in here and there that some of the harms that we assume go along with incest are social constructions, and we shouldn't be so easily dismissive of incest. You can look at the writings of Michel Foucault and see that he is normalizing intergenerational relationships, so that the taboo against sexual relations between an adult and a child is a social construct that is oppressive. And he famously signed, along with many other people who are in this postmodern movement, a petition to the French government to decriminalize the age of consent laws that existed at that time. And as you look into queer theory, there it does tend to push boundaries, and some of the boundaries that it pushes you might be surprised at. And anytime you bring this stuff up, people will say, well, you're trying to paint these marginalized people with the brush of the worst thing possible.
Right, the slippery
And
slope fallacy kind
right,
of.
right. And if someone was trying to make up accusations out of whole cloth, then that would be one thing. But you can look in the literature, and I have a series on my YouTube channel that looks at four key figures in postmodernism and shows you the picture on the page where they make the case for breaking social taboos against intergenerational sex and um, child pornography and the incest taboo. And you're going to hear the word TERF thrown around a lot, which is a trans exclusive radical feminists. And these are feminists who have been very much part of this discourse up until we got to the queer theory stuff. And they said, okay, we're willing to go along the critical theory perspective as it relates to men versus women, but as soon as we get to this blowing apart gender sort of stuff, we're going to draw the line there. And many times they're looking at that incursion into the rights of what they saw, what they define women as, that you pointed out with the prison and things like that. But they're going to say no more. And so a lot of those trans exclusionary radical feminists, they're the ones pointing out how the queer theory stuff does not seem to be able to set boundaries. Because if you were to say, okay, we're going to disrupt norms, just ask, like, which norms are you're not going to disrupt, which norms will you say no, that's too far. And you can't draw boundaries on a philosophy whose whole purpose is to look for boundaries and break through them. And so generally you'll probably be able to get somebody to draw a boundary because you're going to point out some terrible extreme, but then you just have to work back from that and say, well, if that's your boundary, how do you define what that boundary is? And then they'll talk about some principles that they use to define that boundary. You can say, well, is there any other domain of the world or of life where similar principles can be applied to draw a boundary? And so I think that's just that process of exploring a philosophy to understand what its downstream implications are, because those implications may cause you to reconsider how much credibility or credence you give them at the surface level. And so that's all I have to say about that. But again, you read it and look at the stuff yourself. So we're getting to the last few slides here. So we talked about this philosophical background that you bring to the debate, and it's these lenses that you put on your eyes so that when you use the term man and woman, you're actually defining them in different ways by having different assumptions about where they are anchored in. But it also has implications for how you conceptualize some of the battlegrounds that this culture war is being waged on. So if you take the issue of gender dysphoria, okay, so from the conventional view, in gender dysphoria, you have an individual that experiences dysphoria. And if you look at the underlying issues for why that dysphoria is there, that can be therapeutic. And that individual can either resolve their dysphoria or adapt and embody a different gender expression that gives some form of resolution, complete or partial, to that experience of dysphoria. Now, in doing that, it does not change the biological reality of their sex or gender. And gender nonconformity expands the range of expression for a given sex, and it does not require society to adapt to them. So these are all just a bunch of big words to say you can go out there and you can find trans men and trans women who look for all the world as the opposite gender than their biological reality. But if you ask them, they'll say, I know I'm a man, but I choose to live and inhabit the existence of a woman. And I disagree with all of the things that queer theory is doing. And I disagree that they claim that the entire trans community believes the same way about all of these issues that they do. But this is still how I've chosen to live my life. And I know that I'm different, and I'm not expecting society to completely upend itself in all of its assumptions to accommodate me. And that's just how I choose to be. Now, that's one perspective that's out there. But if you start to listen to podcasts, and you'll see people who are like that. So to say that the trans community all thinks a particular way is a disservice to what would be considered marginalized trans people who don't necessarily think this way. And some people will say, well, this is kind of how you can draw the line between the T and the Q, where the trans people who really have this activist dimension that want to change and upend society are really more in the Q domain than the T domain, because there are trans people who don't subscribe to that postmodern relativistic perspective. But if you see this issue through the lens of gender theory, then an individual expresses dysphoria. And if you try to do anything to explore why they may be experiencing the dysphoria, then what you're actually trying to do is change them from being a trans person, because you're assuming already they are a trans person because they have the gender dysphoria. And so let's say it was a kid and you have the conventional perspective. Okay. So they come to you, they say, I don't feel comfortable in the changes that my body is going through as being a woman. I don't feel comfortable being a woman. I don't like all the expectations and assumptions of being a woman. I actually do feel like and am a man. And so the psychologist will say, okay, let's explore that. Tell me all of the things that are going on in your life that are part of this, complicated tapestry of who you are. And so that person may go into details about they have feelings of anxiety and depression that they are absolutely certain are the result of this dysphoria that they have around gender, and that maybe they had an experience of abuse in the past, maybe they have an eating disorder or have had bad experiences, and there's a bunch of stuff going on. And so, from the conventional view, the therapist who is doing that type of therapy will say, well, let's explore and address some of these other issues because they need to be explored anyway, in addition to the gender dysphoria stuff. And we're not going to do any irreversible steps on the gender front until we've addressed some of these issues. And so they'll spend time going through and working through those things. Now, a certain percentage of people who go through that process that can be extensive and lengthy will find that as they address and understand those other dimensions of their existence better, for whatever reason, the gender dysphoria goes away, or that their understanding of what it meant to them changes such that they no longer feel the need to undergo certain interventions. It doesn't happen for everyone, but it happens in a surprisingly frequent enough instance that the study that you're pointing to at least raises the question that you may be doing a disservice if you don't allow for that process to actually take place in some people. And that's where we go to the next one, which is if you start out assuming that any kid who experiences gender dysphoria by definition is trans, then if a doctor goes in and says, well, let's see if you're autistic or if you have depression or anxiety or any of these other complex issues, well, then the activists are saying that's conversion therapy. You're trying to actually manipulate them and turn them from being trans. You're trying to detrans them. That's unethical because when they tried to do that for gay people, we saw how unethical it was. And so, if this perspective on the nature of the condition is what is in the air, therapists will actually intentionally not go down any of those roads. And so, an adolescent who's presenting that does have all of those complex psychological issues, the therapist does not feel comfortable doing anything other than affirming because they open themselves up to professional liability to be branded with detransition conversion therapy. And so that's why, from this perspective, anything other than affirmation is unethical because you're trying to detrans someone who is inherently trans. And that nonconformity with gender stereotypes, the solution of that is to align yourself to the gender stereotype. If you feel the affinity towards all the things that are stereotypically feminine, you are a woman. And so now we need to change your body to match your reality, who you actually are. And that's where all of the surgery and the hormones go into. But the solution there and the nature of the problem there are all shaped by those foundational understandings of how you conceive of gender and identity in the first place. And so to say that this is the solution carries the assumption that your worldview and your perspective is actual reality. You mentioned before something that I thought was really important, which is that all of these ideas and all these diagrams are our attempts to map out the real world, to understand and conceptualize the real world. And that's very true. But you have to be able to realize that any of these things that we're doing are creating a map, but the world is not the map. And there are going to be times where we think that we've understood the world, or we come up with a really creative and unique way of understanding humanity and how it exists, and we try to lay that map over the world. But if it's not right, we need the freedom to be able to say, hold on a second, our map isn't exactly confronting reality. And if your map instead reflects how you wish reality was rather than how reality actually is, then that statement that reality always bats last will become very true. And you may end up going down pathways that you'll later realize you regret because they clash with reality. And some people look at this issue and they say that that postmodern perspective intentionally separates itself from the rational scientific perspective, which is trying to match reality, and instead it's trying to shape reality or shape our world through all of this activism and looking at the world this way, and it's finding itself into harm for vulnerable populations because they then get put into a medical system where doctors do not feel comfortable actually exploring the normal therapeutic avenues that they would do for fear of being branded a bigot or an unethical physician. And you can just look at the various European systematic reviews and reports that are coming out. There's something called the WPATH files, which was based on a leak of the main body that has established a lot of the affirmative care model. That then all the other professional societies that deal with this, whether it's Endocrine Society, Pediatric Society, or the psychology associations, they've all just relied on WPATH's work product. And you start to realize how ideological it is, how much activists are sitting in there and they're betraying basic fundamental medical ethical principles in trying to shape a way to deal with this issue where they front loaded all of the assumptions of this ideological perspective so that doctors don't feel comfortable actually deviating from it. The CAS report is another report that Britain undertook to try to understand how they were dealing with it. And it also points out a lot of these different issues. So if you just Google WPATH files or CAS report, you'll see the other side of this issue and where it could potentially go wrong. Okay, so we kind of looked at how the lens that you put on will change how you understand the nature of the condition of gender dysphoria. And you and I would probably never say, oh, there are Muslim kids and Baptist kids and Mormon kids. They're born, I can tell that's a Muslim kid, or oh, I can tell that's a Baptist kid. The kids are born and then they encounter different ways in belief, or they inherit them from their family, and then gradually their identity becomes shaped, and that's what they are. And asserting that a child who experiences gender dysphoria is a trans child is kind of putting the definition before the horse. That's the issue that's coming to fray, because gender dysphoria has been expressed as not feeling comfortable in the body that you inhabit, having some sense that you don't want to be that. If you go and listen to transition stories and detransition stories, you'll get a broad spectrum of the way people related to the biological reality of their gender, and we're not comfortable with it. And if you talk to women and men who grew up and went through adolescence and puberty, a lot of them will say, well, I was a kid and suddenly I'm this creature that's changing and developing, and there's all these different, the way I interface with society is different. I'm getting different attention from women. I'm feeling these urges that I never felt before. There's a lot of discomfort that happens around that. And in the past, people would look to parents or look to society, and the message a lot of that time was, these things happen. It's crummy. It's periods suck. The fact that all the boys that you previously treated you as equals are now going to be interfacing you with a way that reflects their attraction to you, that sucks. There's a bunch of different things that the messaging was, these are challenges, you can adapt and overcome it, and it'll get better, and you'll come to integrate that aspect of your life. Well, that signal of messaging is diminished now and has been overcrowded by a different message, which is a lot of the dysphoria that you're feeling actually means you're trans. And we are humans, and we take stories and narrative and we infuse them with our experience, and they give a structure to where we can go, the options that we can go. And this narrative of gender dysphoria equals trans, therefore hormones and surgery, and anyone who would push back or say anything otherwise is a bigot. And if your family doesn't support you, you should cut off with them. And if any doctor doesn't affirm you, then they are a bad doctor. Like, that's a very detailed path that becomes then the highest signal that our kids are being exposed to. And so this is the part of the speech where people say, well, see, Streeter thinks that you can convert people into being trans. You can convert, people don't convert to being trans. People can't be swept away by ideology. And the thing is, we're not talking about trans. We're talking about the experience of gender dysphoria. And then the narrative about whether that means trans or whether that's just puberty or whatever, that's laid on top. And that's what we get from society around us. And you can say, well, they're persistent, consistent, and insistent. Those are the criteria for gender dysphoria that then justify the gender affirmation. Just go look in the history of that sort of stuff, because when you dig into the medical justifications that have been used for this gender affirmative pathway, you realize that things are being applied in non-medically ethical ways. There's a Dutch study that was originally used to justify using puberty blockers for kids and then cross-sex hormones and subsequently surgery. But in order to even go into that study, they had to have screened you, and you can't have had depression, anxiety, a family that didn't accept you, or comorbid psychological conditions. If you had any of those conditions, they excluded you from the study. But it gets even worse than that, where the metrics that they used before and after intervention weren't scientifically sound, and they just introduced another bias. But beyond that, just the fact that that's how that study was designed, and now you look at the population of patients that are going through those therapies now, and they're not excluding patients that have those comorbid conditions. They're actually saying if you have that comorbid condition, then transition will probably help you. So you're selecting a different patient population. And then the very things that tend to need to be addressed, whether it's anxiety, depression, family situations, or whatever, are not being addressed because the therapists are afraid that if they do anything other than affirm, then their license will be in jeopardy. It's just a setup for something called a medical misadventure. And that's where the entire medical profession is going down a pathway that everyone thinks is right, but that's just because we haven't stayed to our obligation of medical ethics, rational scientific inquiry, and evidence based medicine. And we've allowed a lot of things to break through and interface with vulnerable patients without doing due diligence in making sure that we have not done harm first. And so, first, do no harm is an important principle that has gotten lost in this entire debate. And you could say, Streeter, you're full of it. Those are all total lies. You've seen it yourself. People are only allowed to look at one side and one perspective on this issue. And if anyone raises the problem, you get shouted down or demonized. And that's not how medicine is supposed to work. If it was like, a patient has kidney disease, we think this therapy might help. You want people to be critical of it and look at different perspectives of it. You want people to look how the outcomes are, and you want to make sure you're tracking the outcomes. Like, one of the major deficiencies of the way that this affirmative care model has happened is that they're not tracking sufficiently the various outcomes, and they're not doing what would normally be done. Like, the WPATH files has an instance where they acknowledge that one of the patients got liver cancer that they said is probably the result of the hormonal therapy that they intervened on. And in any other type of study with a limited population like that, that would be a trigger for what's called a sentinel event, where you pause everything, you go back and you say, how did this happen? Is this related to our therapy? We have to make sure we get this right, so that this could be just the tip of the iceberg of further negative consequences down the line. That's how ethical research is supposed to be done. But when you see that being realized in the WPATH files leak, they just dismiss it, and there's no rigid medical ethical protocol in place for addressing these things. And you could say, okay, well, that's just, that every procedure has its downsides, has its drawbacks, has its complications, but you have to realize the scope of these procedures. This is not cosmetic surgery. We're taking children who are not even sexual beings yet, and we are halting their puberty. And they're learning that it's starting something called a therapeutic cascade, which means that if you do that step, then almost 95, 99% of the time, you're going to do the next step, which is cross-sex hormones. And almost 90% of the time, you're going to do the next step, which is surgery. And so a therapeutic cascade is where doctors have intervened and done something, and it's led to then another type of intervention that has to take place, or is increase the likelihood that it take place, and another one and another one. And so you start compounding the side effects and the complications as you go down that rate, rather than saying, okay, well, hold on a second. If we hadn't intervened, what would the outcome have been? And because not intervening is no longer an option, and the voices that have said, hold on a second, we know that watchful waiting in a lot of these early kids, puberty and adolescence will tend to resolve the gender dysphoria. Like, those voices have been called bigoted and backward and not with the times. And so the affirmation care model has started to take dominance in it, and it's swept through Europe and it's swept through America. But Europe is now seeing the negative aspects of it and putting the brakes on. And America, it's still part of the cultural warfare, where if you're a progressive, if you're a Democrat, and if you're a good person, you are going to only fight for affirmative care model. If you're backwards, conservative, a Trump retard, and bigoted, then you're going to fight against this sort of thing. And so that's where I was able to finally start giving voice to some of my perspective on this, because it's not, you know, you can debate these philosophies, you can debate the identities, you're going to get stuck in the weeds, but medical ethics is something that is important to get right. And you can have a concern for making sure that you're not intervening on people. And, puberty blocker, cross-sex hormone surgery cascade, those interventions sterilize someone. And so you're taking a child who is not even sexual, because they realized early on that some of these kids that get the puberty blocker, they are inorgasmic. They are unable to orgasm as they develop. Apparently, puberty and adolescence, going through that process is necessary in order for you to have the capacity to orgasm or to even feel sexual arousal. And so they're finding that there's a huge amount of sexual dysfunction that the clinicians didn't even know about. And so that's how haphazard this advancement of this intervention has taken place. And the practical effects is you're taking a bunch of what are essentially gender non-conforming kids who are in distress. You're putting them on a cascade that is going to sterilize them. How can a child consent to never being able to be a parent or nurse their child? How can a child consent to disrupting their sexual function when they're not even sexual beings yet? And you can say, well, the parents make that decision for them. Well, what parent is going to consent to sterilize their kid? Well, this isn't sterilization. This is an affirmative care model. They're going to commit suicide if you don't do this. And so we've got to do this. Well, go and look at the statistics about suicide, because these kids are presenting not just with gender dysphoria, but with anxiety and depression. And each of those things have a suicide rate with them. And when the people have plugged in the numbers and done it, the suicide rate is no more than kids who have these other issues also have. And so you need the chance to be able to address all of these underlying issues, because they're all part of the complex tapestry of each of these kids' experiences. And if you disable the ability of clinicians to actually do this, then you're preventing an important therapeutic dimension to addressing the significant and important needs of a young person. Now, there are networks of parents who are afraid of alienation from their children, but they've researched this stuff and they realize that the issue is not as black and white. The science is not settled, and that there are serious concerns. And they have secret Facebook groups and secret meetings because they don't want their kids to realize that they are looking at the other side of this issue, because along with the activist dimension of all this stuff is a very rigid, if your family doesn't support you, they are bad, and you're probably better off cutting yourself out of their life, and we will be your sparkle family. And come here, I'll be your sparkle family. And I know that if you found that little message in any particular church religious group, you'd say, hold up, red flag. That's what cults do. And so parents are afraid of being alienated from their children. It's hard to have discussions with a kid who, in addition to feeling dysphoria, um, is immersing themselves in a social media mediated milieu of that type of messaging. It's really hard to sort things out. Anyway, so that I probably went way further into that than I had intended. I probably went way further into that than I had intended, but there's a couple of other issues that we could potentially look at, but I think we should probably, for brevity's sake, keep it in. The same sort of thing happens on the question of women's sports. Just remember, before you decide what is right and wrong, just put on the different glasses and say, okay, from the conventional view, this is how you're going to see the issue, and try to give it the best logical case that you can. And then just say, okay, if I did see it from this other perspective, where I did believe that women are defined by their affinity for these socially constructed things, then I can understand how you would see this issue differently. And still, you can be a rational, good person and earnestly believe that you're fighting for a good cause and do that. And even if you don't agree with it, you can still then see the people who are advocating for it as good people. They're just, you just disagree on some foundational basic things, but then maybe rather than fighting over this top level stuff and calling each other names, you can just understand why it is and how it is that you've come to see this issue the way that you have. Because a lot of the times, these people have wrestled with somebody in their life, a loved one who has themselves struggled with the issue that is out there around gender. And in order to show love and solidarity to that person, they've really allowed that perspective to be the perspective that they want to inhabit. And that's okay. We should live in a society where people have the freedom to choose the way that they want to see the world. It's just we have to adjudicate those different perspectives when it comes to societal policy and things like that. Same thing, just make sure you look at both things. And that's my last slide, just to remember that this great debate, you can get deep in the weeds on issues about affirmative care and bathrooms and prisons and everything. You just have to step back and realize that it's really a debate about some of these foundational philosophical approaches to the world, to yourself, to the way that we as humans interact and relate to another. And it's possible as a good person to hold either of these perspectives. And the way that you hold it may change over time. You may start out with a very conventional, rigid view and then realize that there are some things from the postmodern gender theory perspective that you want to integrate into your perspective so that you can account for the things that they do point out. And the same thing, you could have a very queer theory, gender theory perspective on these questions and realize that there are some important considerations that balance the rights of biologic women that maybe you should find some way to integrate into it, and that inherently then starts to moderate the dogmatic approach that some more extreme activists may have. Now, just be aware that you may find yourself on the outs with your previous in group because the pressure for conformity is very strong in the movements that are vocal about these things. And if you do push back against them from either perspective, just be wary of going into those radical extremes. Be wary of dehumanizing other people because when you do that, you just end up treating other people in ways that on reflection you wouldn't want to do.
Let me just say here, I think sometimes you're positioned as being 100% entirely against a certain modality of treatment. And what I hear you saying is there may be multiple modalities needed by limiting this issue to there's one solution to the problem. The problem has to be addressed in this way. This is exactly what's going on. Anything else is marginalizing to the person. And hence, here's the treatment that is only the only treatment that's allowed and accepted. What it does is it means that all the humans who have anything similar to this have to fit into one box.
Yeah,
And I think when people position you that way, it makes you look like you're the bad guy
yeah,
who wants to deny the existence of transgender people. And I understand where that side is coming from. Again, let's go back for a moment with the religious view. If it were only the conventional, scientific, rational, logical view that was pushing against them, because that view has, again, in its healthiest framing, it has the ability to sit calm with itself and go, hey, my care and concern is your child. My care and concern is your friend. My care and concern is your sister, whatever it is. And to say, there's a lot of things going on here. This issue's really complex. This may be the solution. This may be what's going on. That may be the solution. That may be what's going on. Can you be patient for a minute while you and I and your child, your loved one, sort through all of this and try to figure out as close as we can to what's really going on so that we can pick the right modality of treatment to
mm,
help you and your loved one have the most positive outcome possible.
yeah,
And I think if that's what everyone on what they perceive as the enemy side was approaching it as, I think there would be an ability to sort of sit still and go, "Oh, okay, you care about positive outcomes just like I do." Because
yeah.
if we get rid of the nonsense, both sides of the healthy people want positive outcomes.
Yeah. No, you put your
And
finger on a very important point with that, Bill. And to, I guess, show you how you're right on that, there's a debate that happened in the Florida Medical Board that's on my YouTube channel, but they brought in experts on both sides of this issue and listened to them. And the question at the end of it is, are we going to allow any sort of hormonal intervention at all? And the doctors did not agree on that. And I tended to agree with the doctors who were against flat out prohibition. And that's because there's a principle at play here was that as clinicians, we have to have the capacity to explore disease and to explore therapy. And so if you were to say, no doctor can do any sort of intervention like this. That you have to have made sure that we've already gone through the evidence-based process to determine that that is an illegitimate therapy if it's been postulated as a potential therapy, which means you have to do the study. And so I'm on the side of the doctors that say, okay, we will allow affirmative care, but it has to be done with all of the structured, rigorous, scientific, evidence-based methodology that we would expect, whether as a chemotherapy agent or anything else, which means that you have careful patient selection. You do not deviate from protocol. You have review of how things are going. You don't let things fall out just because people stopped wanting to come. You follow up on all of your complications. You have a registry where you report all of the findings, and whether or not it's a positive or a negative outcome, you report the findings so that the public can learn what you've done, because all of these different steps have been betrayed on the pathway of this affirmative care model. And so if you allow the medical society or state government to say this intervention cannot be performed, period, and the doctors don't have the chance to really understand it, then I think we're doing a disservice to medicine because we're allowing the state to intervene where it should not be intervening. It should still hold medicine accountable to its obligation for ethical and evidence-based medicine, but you can't assert that much control over them. And but at the same token, if institutions are found to be breaking the public's trust by betraying those medical ethical principles, there has to be consequences for it. And so that's the thing that we're really struggling with right now, because there have been instances in the past where people were really compassionately worried about struggling people in their lives. And there's this phenomenon of lobotomies where it was heralded as this great success because you could take these people who were in great distress and have a simple procedure done, and they would suddenly be very complacent and compliant and you could deal with their lives. But it interfered as we realized and stepped back and said, hold on a second, this intervention did not actually arise through ethical evidence-based procedures. And as soon as they started to look at the outcomes and look at the evidence and get past the fact that the guy who invented it got a Nobel Prize and that it was the talk of the town, and even what is it, John F. Kennedy's sister had it done, that it ultimately it was absolutely not efficacious, not ethical, and it was highly problematic. It's now a dark stain, and it's taught in courses of, hey, this is where the entire medical industry, from the doctor at the ground level to the institutions at the top level, can get things wrong because we did not follow what we know are ethical and sound principles for the way that we guide our medical investigations. So my position is you should not ban things like that. You should allow rigorous scientific methodology to be applied. But if that methodology ultimately comes out that it is unethical to do these interventions without any gatekeeping, because that's the thing that people will say, well, if you say that certain populations of this patient should get it, you're gatekeeping, and that's wrong. Medicine is about gatekeeping. It's about making sure that you are choosing the right population, because there may be a population of kids that will benefit from this. But in order for you to know which ones will benefit from it, you have to do the studies, collect the data, follow up, and be open to being wrong. And then you have to selectively choose by excluding the patients for whom there's a significant chance that it will not be the correct intervention. And there's a lot more to say about therapeutic cascade and who it is that you're actually harming or who it is that you're trying to benefit about that, but we will not go that far.
So let me finish my thought and then we'll wrap up. It's if it was just the group of people who were logic based, who could calmly hold space to say like, "Hey, let's take our time through this. I care about the outcome just as much as you do." I think the other side could deal with it. I think what happens though again is that in that conventional view is also a segment of people who are the right-wing religious point of view, and that is a huge threat to any segment of the population that understands what it means to be marginalized and abused at the expense of irrational religious beliefs.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
to what we have to do is find a way to have everybody just slow down and go, and again, we're not there yet. That's the problem. We have
Yeah.
so many more decades of rooting out irrational belief as a factor in how we create policies and make decisions in societies, right? But if you could get that group completely out of the way, because what's happening is they're right behind the conventionalists and they're peering over the shoulder and they're just waiting to get their jabs in to create policies and make rules based on irrational religious beliefs. And so the gender theory postmodern relativist is living in fear that if they don't take strong positions, they will be ran over by the religious right.
Right.
And what we have to do is say, look, religion is just not going to impact policies anymore. It is an irrational way of thinking. From here on out, this is going to be data based, and we still going to have biases. We're still going to have agendas. We're going to have to sort. That's just the nature of being a human being and having groups of humans. But we're no longer going to say that, you know, Moses, whatever Moses said about how we should treat each other is how we're going to operate in this issue, or whatever we claim in a text that was written 3,000 years ago with lots of absurdities that we agree we've all collectively thrown out. And yet we're still going to hold to certain ones because somehow it makes us feel better about our religious identity. Those can't impact it. And as soon as you take those out, then the conventionalist can sit on his own ground and calmly talk to the gender theory postmodern relativist and say, hey, we both have the same desire here, which is positive outcomes for these people. We have no goal to deny their existence. We simply want to make sure there's checks and balances so that we come up with the best modality for each person. And so we don't regret causing mass amounts of harm to a segment of humans on one side or the other. Because, like every other issue in humanity, this issue is also complex. And whatever our explanations are for gender dysphoria, it may not just be one pathway and one modality of treatment. And so let's get this right. And slowing people down, by the way, even if you handle this in the healthiest manner possible, there will still be casualties.
Yeah. It's all trade-offs. And so it's
So,
trying to find the
yeah.
right.
So we have to figure out what is the pathway to the most positive outcome for the most people in this situation. And it seems like slowing down for a minute, gauging all the data, rooting out the biases, weighing the data on its merit, and having a cross the aisle conversation from both sides, agreeing that we're going to value outcomes and allow both sides to present their information gives us the best chance to do that. And I don't see anything that you've said that counters that idea, that doesn't encourage us to do it. And I would say to folks, if you watch this interview, if you have a problem with something I said or a problem with something John said, please put it in the comments. I'll absolutely be watching them. And we we and society at large, the healthiest among us, we want to get this right. And I don't have any desire, and I don't think you do either, John, to deny someone's human experience. And I don't hear you, and I'm definitely not saying that any one modality is the right modality, any other modality is the wrong modality. Rather, we can't just take a certain side and go, nope, every time it's gender dysphoria, this is what's going on. Any other information is not allowed. This is the treatment that has to happen. And I don't know that I know yet what the data says. I know some data says that it's a large amount of people who the gender dysphoria seems to desist, and hence early treatment is harmful. I, and there's other data that says that the opposite is true. And I'm still trying to sort it out, and I think we are right on the cusp of this data sort of having to be forced to get aligned with what the data really says. And I think it's fine to have an opinion about which side you think is best representing what's really happening. But I think you also have to be open to being wrong. And I think all of us should be skeptical of any one side being absolutely true, and we need to have some sort of self humility and societal humility that goes, man, we've definitely got it wrong in the past. Going forward, we're probably going to get some things wrong still, but let's do our best to figure out how to create support, resources, and medical assistance that gives this group of human beings the best chance at a positive, fulfilling life, fulfilling, happy, uh, joyful life. And our biases and our preconceived notions have no business getting in the way of that outcome.
Well said.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to take the privilege of just having the last word, which is as soon as you posted this, I posted a comment that then spurred a bunch of discussion after that. But I just want to leave your audience with these questions that I posted on your post, which is just a couple of questions. As you start to understand this, just reflect on these and just try to come up with your own answer, your own understanding of them. Which is, is a transgender individual an innate biological reality or a psychosocial identity that can be influenced by ideology? Is gender dysphoria an innate, unchanging, objective sign of true transgenderism? If gender is fluid, what does this mean regarding irreversible surgical and hormonal interventions in kids who are still undergoing the process of developing their maturity and identity? If a significant number of kids who are getting hormone and surgical affirmation are autistic or homosexual and would statistically likely reconcile their dysphoria without irreversible interventions, what does it mean that the affirmation therapies end up sterilizing them? Does it mean you're sterilizing a significant number of gay children or autistic children? What does the experience of detransition mean to these other considerations? Just the reality, regardless of what the rate is, the fact that there is detransition. This is a deep rabbit hole to go down, and I warned you that you won't come out of it unscathed. People who previously respected you will paint you as a bigot from here on out, and hopefully this conversation will mute some of that, but it may inflame it, so we'll see.
Will you share with me? I want to make sure that in the show notes for this episode, I'm planning to release it later today. The show notes for this episode, that you give me the link for the after school video. By the way, I'll just say
Yeah,
something general. Every human being should spend 6 months watching videos on after school. It is one of my favorite YouTube channels on the planet. It gives a wide array of experts, and I think most of them are very well informed, but not always agreeing, a platform to share ideas and then beautiful artwork sort of put to those ideas so that it sort of sinks in on multiple levels. Please share that video so that I can make sure that's in the show notes. And then also share your video that shows these authors of some of this philosophy pushing boundaries from your
yeah,
channel, where we can see that, hey, these frontiers, these pioneers on the frontier of this issue are maybe speaking to things that we really do need to address, and in other ways maybe pushing boundaries that we all on the healthy side collectively agree that we can't break. And I think seeing that will be helpful. I would love to watch that video myself to see that. And
okay, very good.
otherwise, I think you did a beautiful job, and I think we navigated this that in a way that any rational human being watching this would sense that our care and concern is for the people, and that we have no desire to cause harm, and then we just simply want to do this in the most ethical, best way possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Amen.
Have an awesome
All
day.
right. You too.
Take it
Take care.
easy.